The wind whispers through vast deserts, across endless expanses of golden sand where jagged mountain peaks pierce the clouds. Beyond lie the steppes where horsemen roam, and further still, cities with gleaming marble and bustling bazaars. This forbidding yet irresistible landscape formed the backdrop for humanity's greatest adventure in commerce and cultural exchange, a network that eventually connected the distant corners of the ancient world. The term Silk Road conjures romantic images of camel caravans laden with exotic goods traversing desolate landscapes. This name, coined in 1877 by German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen, simplifies what was in reality an intricate web spanning thousands of miles across the Eurasian continent. This vast tapestry of interconnected pathways stretched from Chang'an, modern Xi'an in China, to Constantinople, now Istanbul, and the Mediterranean ports of Antioch and Alexandria. For nearly 2 millennia, from the 2nd century BC to the 16th century AD, these interlinked corridors served as the world's primary channels for the exchange of goods, ideas, religions, and technologies. Humanity's first experiment in globalization. The ancient world's greatest commercial network was no single highway, but rather a complex system of branching trails. Travelers and merchants rarely traversed its entire length. Instead, goods passed through countless hands in a relay system of trade that connected east and west. Despite the absence of any overarching political authority or unified control, this remarkable achievement in human cooperation transcended political boundaries, survived the rise and fall of empires, and ultimately transformed the societies it touched. The journey along these passages presented formidable challenges. Travelers faced the scorching heat of the Taklamakan Desert, a name that some scholars claim translates to, "Go in and you won't come out." The shifting sands of the Gobi Desert could swallow entire caravans. The breathtaking but treacherous mountain ranges, the Pamirs, the Hindu Kush, the Tian Shan, presented their own perils. Narrow passes buried in winter snow, oxygen-thin air at high altitudes, and steep tracks where a single misstep meant death. Bandits lurked in remote regions, while hostile armies might block passage through territories during times of conflict. Survival along these arduous paths depended on a constellation of oasis settlements that dotted the landscape like islands in a terrestrial sea. These havens, Dunhuang, Turfan, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, became crucial lifelines where travelers could rest, replenish supplies, exchange currency, and trade goods. Many grew into flourishing urban centers with their own unique cultures, blending influences from the diverse peoples who passed through their gates. These cities were not merely way stations, but crucibles of civilization, where ideas mingled as freely as the merchants who carried them. Climate dictated the rhythm of travel across the continent. Summer brought scorching heat to desert regions, while winter rendered mountain passes impossible with deep snow. Merchants planned their journeys according to these seasonal patterns, creating a pulsing movement of goods and people throughout Eurasia. Spring and autumn typically saw the heaviest traffic, with caravans taking advantage of moderate temperatures before the extremes of summer and winter made travel perilous or impossible. The treasures that justified such arduous journeys were numerous and valuable. This commercial web earned its modern name from its most famous luxury commodity, silk, the luminous fabric that China guarded as a state secret for centuries. This precious material became so coveted in the Roman Empire that, at one point, pound for pound, it traded for its weight in gold. But the flow of goods extended far beyond this single textile. From east to west traveled porcelain, jade, spices, tea, paper, and gunpowder. The westward arteries returned gold, silver, glassware, wool, horses, ivory, perfumes, and precious stones to the east. Yet the material goods tell only half the story. Along with commodities traveled something far more significant: knowledge. Buddhism journeyed from India to become a dominant faith in China and East Asia. Mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, and medical techniques passed between civilizations. Musical instruments and architectural styles crossed borders. Crops and agricultural methods transformed distant economies. These connections became conduits for religions, philosophies, art forms, and technologies that would reshape human societies. Few merchants traversed the entire distance from China to the Mediterranean. Instead, goods might change hands dozens of times during their journey, with local traders specializing in specific segments of the passage. This relay system of commerce created a remarkable chain of human connections spanning cultures that often had no direct contact with one another. A bolt of silk leaving a workshop in China might pass through 20 intermediaries before adorning a Roman senator's wife, its origins shrouded in mystery to its final owner. The economic impact of this exchange transformed the lands it touched. Cities that controlled strategic points along the thoroughfares accumulated enormous wealth, which they channeled into monumental architecture, artistic patronage, and scholarly institutions. Merchant classes gained unprecedented influence, challenging traditional power structures based solely on landed aristocracy or military might. New financial instruments developed to facilitate long-distance trade. Letters of credit, partnerships, and early forms of insurance emerged to manage the risks inherent in such ventures. What makes this ancient commercial system particularly remarkable is that it functioned without centralized planning or control. Unlike the Roman roads or Persian royal road, built by imperial decree to serve administrative and military needs, these trading corridors evolved organically, shaped by the collective actions of countless merchants seeking profit. The byways shifted over time, responding to changing political situations, environmental conditions, and economic opportunities. When one avenue became dangerous or unprofitable, traders simply found alternatives. This adaptive commercial phenomenon witnessed and survived the rise and fall of history's greatest empires: the Han and Tang dynasties of China, the Parthian and Sassanid empires of Persia, the Kushans of Central Asia, and the Roman and Byzantine empires all participated in and benefited from its operation. Even the Mongol conquests, which initially brought devastation, ultimately revitalized these transcontinental connections by establishing unprecedented security across vast territories under what historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. The legacy of these ancient connections extends into the modern world. The cities, cultures, and technologies that emerged from this exchange continue to shape contemporary life. Modern discussions of globalization echo debates that occurred along these thoroughfares 2 millennia ago. This history is not merely a tale of distant times, but the foundation upon which today's interconnected world was built. The clock now turns back to the 2nd century BC, when a Chinese emperor's strategic concerns about nomadic threats to his northern frontier set in motion a chain of events that would create history's most significant network of cross-cultural exchange. The tale begins with the Han Dynasty and an adventurous diplomat named Jiang Qian, whose remarkable journeys would open China's eyes to the wider world beyond its borders. The secrets of silk production had been jealously guarded by the Chinese for millennia, before the first threads of this precious fabric found their way westward. Nearly 5,000 years ago, By the 30th century before Christ, Chinese artisans had already mastered the complex art of sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms, and the harvesting of their delicate cocoons. The process was laborious and required meticulous attention. Feeding the caterpillars mulberry leaves, maintaining precise temperatures, carefully unwinding the near-invisible filaments from their cocoons, and weaving them into luminous textiles that shimmered in the light. This extraordinary fabric was more than a mere luxury. It was political currency, spiritual treasure, an artistic medium. Imperial courts reserved the finest specimens for themselves, with colors like imperial yellow, forbidden to commoners under penalty of death. Silk served as official gifts to appease neighboring powers, as currency to pay troops, and as a medium for the earliest Chinese writings. The penalty for revealing the secrets of silk production was death, an indication of how seriously the Chinese state took its monopoly on this remarkable commodity. What the Chinese treasured as a domestic resource would soon become the catalyst for unprecedented international exchange. The path to this transformation began not with merchants seeking new markets, but with a military and diplomatic crisis facing the Han Dynasty that had come to power in 206 BC. After years of internal warfare, following the collapse of the Qin dynasty, the Han rulers found themselves confronting a formidable external threat along their northern frontier: nomadic confederates from the steppes. These mounted warriors from the Mongolian grasslands, distant ancestors of the Huns who would later threaten Rome, continuously raided the settled agricultural communities of northern China. The ambitious Emperor Wu, ascending to the Han throne during the early 2nd century BC, resolved to break the power of these horsemen who seemed to materialize from the wilderness to strike and then vanish with impunity. Combining military campaigns with diplomatic initiatives, he sought to secure his realm's northern borders once and for all. The Han strategy extended beyond direct confrontation. Emperor Wu recognized that facing these superb mounted archers on their home terrain was perilous. Instead, he sought to encircle and isolate the northern nomads by forming alliances with other peoples beyond China's western frontiers. Intelligence reached the court about a tribal confederation called the Yuezhi, once defeated by the steppe nomads and driven westward, who might be motivated to join forces against their common enemy. The mission to locate these potential allies fell to an intrepid court official named Zhang Qian. In the late 100s BC, Emperor Wu dispatched him westward with a party of 100 men to find the Yuezhi and negotiate an alliance. What followed was one of history's most remarkable journeys of exploration. A trek that would last more than a decade and open China's eyes to the vast world beyond its borders. Just weeks into their journey, Zhang Qian and his party were captured by hostile patrols. For 10 years, they remained in captivity among the northern nomads. Though treated well, Zhang Qian even married a woman from these tribes and fathered children. He never abandoned his mission. When opportunity for escape finally arose, he resumed his westward journey with his nomad wife and a handful of his original companions. Zhang Qian pushed onward through territories no Chinese had ever documented before, crossing the formidable Pamit Mountains into what is now Tajikistan and Afghanistan. He finally located the Yuezhi in Bactria, northern Afghanistan, only to discover they had settled into urban life and had little interest in a military venture against their old enemies. Though unsuccessful in his diplomatic objective, Zhang Qian gathered unprecedented information about the lands beyond China's western border. After an absence of 13 years, Zhang Qian returned to Chang'an during the 120s BC, with only one of his original 100 men surviving the journey. The information he brought back transformed Chinese understanding of the world. He described thriving Central Asian kingdoms like Fergana, Sogdiana, and Bactria, with sophisticated cities, agriculture, and commerce. Most tantalizing to Emperor Wu were reports of the exceptional horses bred in the Fergana Valley, larger, stronger, and faster than any in China, and believed to sweat blood, likely a parasitic condition that caused red secretions. These heavenly horses became an obsession for Emperor Wu, who saw in them the key to military superiority against the frontier threats. A few years later, as the 2nd century BC neared its final decade, he sent Zhang Qian on a second expedition westward, this time with more diplomatic success. Official relations were established with several Central Asian states, and a Han envoy reached as far as Parthia, modern Iran. Most importantly, Zhang Qian secured trade agreements that brought the coveted Fergana horses to China. To support this new diplomatic and commercial outreach, Emperor Wu established a series of military colonies and garrisons across the Hexi Corridor, the narrow strip of land between the Tibetan Plateau and the Gobi Desert that formed the natural passage from China to Central Asia. These outposts evolved into important trading centers and safe havens for merchants. The military colonies introduced Chinese agricultural techniques to new territories and created a buffer zone against nomadic incursions. The defensive infrastructure expanded dramatically. Existing walls and fortifications were connected and extended to become what would later be known as the Great Wall. Watchtowers dotted the landscape, allowing rapid communication through fire signals. Garrison troops not only provided security, but also served as customers for merchants, creating local markets at these frontier outposts. Dunhuang emerged as the most significant of these frontier settlements. Located at the eastern edge of the Taklamakan Desert, this oasis marked the point where travelers had to choose between the northern or southern paths around this deadly expanse of sand. The town quickly grew from a military outpost to a thriving commercial hub, where Chinese merchants met their Central Asian counterparts. With security established along the Hexi Corridor, Chinese goods, particularly silk, began flowing westward in unprecedented quantities. In exchange, exotic items entered China: horses from Fergana, jade from Khotan, grapes and wine-making technology from Central Asia, new varieties of fruit and vegetables, and even musical instruments and dances that became fashionable at the Han court. The impact of these exchanges extended beyond material goods. Chinese artisans adopted motifs from Western textiles and metalwork. Buddhist missionaries from the Kushan Empire would soon travel these newly established pathways, bringing their faith to China. Medical knowledge passed between cultures, enriching therapeutic traditions in both East and West. Zhang Qian's journeys, undertaken for military and diplomatic purposes, had inadvertently created the foundations for what would become the world's most significant pre-modern trade network. A single generation witnessed the transformation of isolated kingdoms and empires into participants in a vast commercial exchange system that would endure for nearly 2 millennia. An ancient Chinese proverb states that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. In this case, the first steps of Zhang Qian's diplomatic missions initiated a journey that would connect civilizations across thousands of miles and countless generations. What began as a strategic response to border security concerns evolved into a transcontinental dialogue of cultures, religions, technologies, and ideas that would shape the development of human civilization. Between the flourishing Han Empire in the east and the expanding Roman Empire in the west stood a powerful intermediary, the Parthian Empire. Rising from the ashes of the Seleucid realm in what is now Iran, the Parthians strategically positioned themselves along the emerging trade corridors between China and the Mediterranean world. Their domain encompassed modern Iran, Iraq, and parts of Turkey, Armenia, and Turkmenistan, territories that contained crucial sections of what would become the central arteries of transcontinental exchange. The Parthians recognized the immense profit potential in controlling these vital passages. Unlike later empires that sometimes sought to dominate the entire length of the commercial network, the Parthians embraced their role as middlemen. They improved infrastructure inherited from their Persian and Seleucid predecessors, maintaining and extending the royal road that ran from Susa, near the Persian Gulf, to Sardis in western Anatolia. Caravanserais, fortified inns providing shelter, food, and security for travelers, were constructed at regular intervals, typically a day's journey apart. Parthian authorities implemented sophisticated systems to regulate trade, including customs posts and standardized taxation. Their stable silver coinage facilitated transactions across their vast realm. Most importantly, they maintained relative peace within their borders, allowing merchants to travel with reasonable security. This Pax Parthica created the preconditions for flourishing commerce, though the ongoing Romano-Parthian conflicts periodically disrupted the western segments of the trade channels. The Parthian strategy of controlling east-west commerce proved remarkably successful. Their merchants grew wealthy by purchasing Chinese goods from intermediaries at their eastern frontiers and selling them at substantial markups to Western buyers. This commercial hegemony had a significant political dimension as well. By controlling the flow of luxury goods to Rome, the Parthians gained economic leverage over their Western rival. The vast transfer of gold and silver from Rome to pay for Eastern luxuries caused recurring financial crises in the Roman economy. While the Parthians dominated the central portion of the transcontinental exchange, numerous smaller kingdoms played crucial roles as interconnecting links in the commercial chain. The Kushan Empire, centered in what is now northern India, Afghanistan, and parts of Central Asia, created a critical bridge between the Chinese, Indian, and Persian worlds. Emerging from Yuezhi nomads who had settled in Bactria, the Kushans established a multilingual, multicultural realm that became a crossroads of commerce and ideas. Under rulers like Kanishka I in the early decades of the 2nd century after Christ, the Kushan Empire reached its zenith, controlling territories from the Aral Sea to the Ganges River Valley. Their coins, inscribed in Greek script but featuring Indian, Persian, and Central Asian deities, symbolized their multicultural identity. The Kushans patronized Buddhism, facilitating its spread along the commercial corridors to China. Their realm became a melting pot where Greeks, Indians, Persians, and Chinese exchanged goods and ideas in cosmopolitan cities like Peshawar, Taxila, and Mathura. Further north, the Sogdian city-states around Samarkand and Bukhara emerged as specialized actors in the growing commercial drama. The Sogdians, an Iranian people with a talent for languages and trade, established merchant colonies throughout Central Asia and China. Their commercial acumen made Sogdian synonymous with merchant in many regions. Their linguistic versatility, many Sogdians were multilingual, made them ideal intermediaries. The traders gradually extended their operations eastward, eventually establishing permanent communities in the Chinese capital Chang'an and other major urban centers. Sogdian merchant letters, discovered in a watchtower near Dunhuan, reveal the sophisticated commercial operations of these traders. Detailed market information, credit arrangements, and trading strategies discussed between partners separated by thousands of miles. These documents provide rare first-hand evidence of the complex commercial networks operating across Eurasia, where trusted family members manage distant branches of trading enterprises. In the western reaches of this commercial system, the desert city of Palmyra played a similar connecting role. Situated at a crucial oasis in the Syrian desert, Palmyra grew from a local trading post to a magnificent city whose wealth derived almost entirely from long-distance commerce. Palmyrene merchants specialized in luxury goods bound for Roman markets: silk, spices, perfumes, and exotic stones. Their caravans, sometimes numbering hundreds of camels, traversed the dangerous desert routes between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. Bilingual inscriptions in Aramaic and Greek from Palmyra honor prominent merchants and caravan leaders, demonstrating the high social status accorded to successful traders. The spectacular monuments of the city, temples, colonnaded streets, a vast agora, and elaborate tombs, testify to the enormous wealth generated by this commerce. For several centuries, Palmyrene merchant families operated extensive networks reaching from Rome to India, exemplifying the entrepreneurial energy driving transcontinental trade. These various intermediaries, Parthians, Kushans, Sogdians, and Palmyrenes, created an interconnected commercial ecosystem that enabled goods from China to reach Mediterranean markets despite the absence of direct contact between the Han and Roman empires. Their specialized roles and cooperation allowed the network to function across political, linguistic, and cultural boundaries. The most famous luxury commodity moving westward through this system was undoubtedly Chinese silk. The luminous fabric reached the Roman world toward the end of the 1st century before Christ, where it created an immediate sensation. Roman women embraced the diaphanous material for its sensual qualities and exotic origin. The Roman Senate, alarmed by both the moral implications of these revealing garments and the drain of gold to pay for them, attempted unsuccessfully to prohibit men from wearing silk during the reign of Tiberius. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, writing during the Flavian dynasty, lamented, "At the lowest computation, India, China, and the Arabian Peninsula take from our empire 100 million sesterces every year. That is what our luxuries and our women cost us." His complaint reflected a widespread concern about the negative balance of trade with the East. Yet despite official disapproval, the Roman appetite for silk only increased with time. Roman understanding of silk's origins remained remarkably inaccurate. Pliny believed that silk came from trees, writing that the Seres, Chinese, comb from the leaves both a woolly substance and a fine white liquid, then wash it with water and draw it out into threads. Other Roman writers imagined silk as a type of wool or cotton. These misconceptions persisted because the Romans had no direct contact with China. All their silk arrived via multiple intermediaries, who carefully guarded information about their sources to protect their profits. The Roman desire for direct access to the source of silk and other Eastern luxuries motivated exploration and attempts to circumvent the Parthian middlemen. Maritime routes through the Red Sea to India developed as alternatives to the overland passages. The anonymous author of The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a sailing guide written during Nero's reign, described trade routes reaching from Egypt to India, with tantalizing mentions of a land called Thena, China, further east. Near the close of the 1st century AD, a Roman envoy named Gan Ying, sent by General Ban Chao of the Han dynasty, reached the shores of the Western Sea, likely the Persian Gulf or Eastern Mediterranean. According to Chinese historical records, Parthian guides discouraged him from continuing further, telling him the sea voyage to Rome would take 2 years, and many died on the journey. This deliberate misinformation protected Parthian commercial interests by preventing direct Romano-Chinese contact. Antioch in Syria and Alexandria in Egypt emerged as the principal western termini of the transcontinental exchange, where Eastern goods entered Mediterranean commercial circuits. Both cities developed specialized markets and workshops, where raw materials from the East were processed into finished goods for Roman consumers. Particularly significant were the purple dye workshops of Tyre, where Chinese silk was redyed with the precious Tyrian purple extracted from murex shellfish, creating fabrics worth their weight in gold. Financial infrastructure evolved to support the growing volume of trade. Banking houses in major commercial centers offered letters of credit to merchants, eliminating the need to transport large quantities of coin across dangerous territory. Specialized commercial law developed to govern transactions between merchants of different legal traditions. Jewish and Syrian trading communities established diaspora networks spanning the Mediterranean, providing trusted agents in foreign ports. By the twilight of the 2nd century after Christ, the volume of trade flowing between East and West had reached unprecedented levels. Chinese silk, Indian spices, Arabian incense, and African ivory flowed westward, while Roman glassware, woolen textiles, gold, and silver moved east. This exchange transformed consumption patterns and material culture in societies thousands of miles apart from one another. Eastern luxuries once considered exotic became integrated into everyday life for wealthy Romans, while Western technologies and artistic styles influenced development in China and Central Asia. The commercial connections established during this period created the framework for even more significant exchanges to come. Religious ideas, scientific knowledge, artistic concepts, and technological innovations would soon follow the paths pioneered by luxury goods. Buddhism would travel from India to China, while Greek philosophical concepts moved eastward. Chinese innovations like paper would eventually transform intellectual life in the West. The stage was set for a dialogue of civilizations unprecedented in human history, all enabled by the humble silkworm and the shimmering fabric produced from its cocoons. The caravans that traversed the vast expanses between East and West carried more than silk, spices, and precious stones. Within the packs of merchants, hidden among the trade goods, traveled something far more significant and enduring: ideas. Of all the cultural transmissions that followed the commercial pathways across Eurasia, none proved more consequential than the eastward journey of Buddhism from its Indian homeland to the diverse societies of Central and East Asia. Buddhism entered China during the later Han Dynasty, not through conquest or official mission, but through the quiet influence of foreign merchants, Indian and Central Asian traders, practicing their faith in private shrines and small temples in Chinese trading towns, attracted the attention of local populations curious about their mysterious rituals and philosophical teachings. Unlike Confucianism and Taoism, which had developed within the Chinese cultural context, Buddhism offered an entirely new worldview, with distinct answers to fundamental questions about existence, suffering, and salvation. The earliest Buddhist texts reached Chinese hands during the 1st century of the Common Era. The challenge of translating these scriptures proved enormous. Not merely a matter of finding equivalent words, but of expressing concepts that had no direct parallel in Chinese thought. Early translators often resorted to borrowing Taoist terminology, creating hybrid interpretations that significantly influenced how Buddhism developed on Chinese soil. This process of translation and adaptation continued for centuries, creating a unique synthesis of Indian religious ideas and Chinese cultural forms. As Buddhism gained followers among the Chinese population, indigenous monks developed a desire to visit the sacred sites of India and study authentic texts directly from Indian masters. In the early 5th century, a Chinese monk named Faxian embarked on a remarkable journey that would last 15 years. Setting out from the Chinese imperial capital, he traversed the terrifying deserts of Central Asia, crossed the snowy mountains, the Pamirs and Hindu Kush, and eventually reached the Buddhist holy sites in northern India. His written account, a record of Buddhist kingdoms, provided detailed information about the lands along the trade passages and became an invaluable guide for later pilgrims. Faxian's pioneering journey established a tradition of Chinese Buddhist pilgrimage that would flourish for centuries. These religious travelers, braving extraordinary hardships to reach India, became important agents of cultural transmission, returning with manuscripts, relics, and artistic models that transformed Chinese Buddhism. Their written accounts, combining geographical information with religious observations, constitute some of our most valuable historical sources for understanding the diverse societies connected by these transcontinental passages. The most remarkable of these pilgrims was undoubtedly Xuanzang, who departed the Tang capital in 629 AD against imperial orders. His 17-year odyssey through Central Asia and India, and his return with hundreds of Sanskrit texts, became the stuff of legend, eventually inspiring the classical Chinese novel Journey to the West. Xuanzang's detailed record of his travels provides an unparalleled window into 7th-century Asian societies, from the Buddhist kingdoms of the Tarim Basin to the great educational centers of India, like Nalanda University. The tremendous effort invested in these pilgrimages and translation projects reflects the profound impact Buddhism had on Chinese society. By the Tang dynasty, the foreign faith had become thoroughly integrated into Chinese culture, producing distinctive schools of thought like Chan, Zen, Buddhism, that blended Indian meditative practices with Chinese philosophical tendencies. Buddhist monasteries became important economic and cultural institutions, owning vast lands, operating banks and pawnshops, and serving as centers of scholarship, art, and medicine. The visual evidence of Buddhism's journey eastward remains most spectacularly preserved at Dunhuan, where the Mogao Caves contain the world's greatest treasury of Buddhist art. Beginning in 366 AD, when a monk named Yuezun claimed to have seen a vision of 1,000 Buddhas on the cliff face, generations of devotees carved hundreds of cave temples into the soft rock. Inside, they created magnificent sculptures and wall paintings that document the evolution of Buddhist art as it absorbed influences from cultures all along the trade passages. These caves served not only as religious shrines, but also as repositories for texts. In 1900, a hidden library cave was discovered containing over 50,000 manuscripts in numerous languages: Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Uyghur, and others, dating from the 5th to early 11th centuries. This extraordinary time capsule revealed the multicultural character of Dunhuan, where religions, languages, and artistic traditions mingled at this crucial junction between East and West. Buddhism was not the only faith to travel the transcontinental exchange pathways. Nestorianism, a form of Christianity declared heretical in the Byzantine Empire, found refuge in Sassanid Persia, and subsequently spread eastward along the trading corridors. In 635 AD, a Nestorian missionary named Alopan arrived in the Chinese imperial center and received permission from Emperor Taizong to establish a Christian presence in China. The famous Nestorian stele, erected in 781 AD, commemorates this event and documents the early history of Christianity in China, in both Chinese and Syriac languages. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion, centered on the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster, also spread along the trade pathways. While never gaining the wide following of Buddhism, it established significant communities in Central Asian trading cities. Archaeological excavations have revealed Zoroastrian fire temples in Samarkand, Bukhara, and other commercial centers. Persian merchants brought their faith with them to China, where it maintained a presence primarily within foreign trading communities. Manichaeism, a syncretic religion founded by the Persian prophet Mani in the 3rd century, displayed remarkable success in adapting to diverse cultural environments as it spread both east and west from its Mesopotamian origins. Combining elements of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Christianity, it appealed to merchants and elites in many societies along the trade passages. Though eventually suppressed in both the Christian and Islamic worlds, it found temporary acceptance among the Uyghurs of Central Asia, who adopted it as their state religion for a period in the 8th and 9th centuries. Judaism established a presence in China through the activities of Persian Jewish merchants. The ancient Jewish community of Kaifeng, which maintained its distinctive identity until the 19th century, likely originated during the Tang dynasty, when Jewish traders settled permanently in China. Archaeological evidence and historical records also document Jewish communities in Central Asian cities, like Samarkand and Bukhara, where they participated actively in transcontinental commerce. The final great religious movement to spread along these pathways was Islam. Following the Arab conquests of the 7th century, Muslim merchants became increasingly prominent in the trade networks connecting the Mediterranean world with Central and East Asia. Their commercial activities laid the groundwork for the later widespread conversion of Central Asian societies to Islam, a process that would dramatically reshape the cultural landscape of the regions between China and the Middle East. While religions constituted the most visible aspect of cultural exchange, countless other elements of human knowledge and creativity traveled these same passages. Medical knowledge moved in multiple directions, with Indian and Persian physicians contributing significantly to Chinese pharmacology, while Chinese diagnostic techniques influenced Western medical traditions. The Indian numerical system, including the concept of zero, traveled west to become what we now call Arabic numerals, revolutionizing mathematical calculation throughout Eurasia. Astronomical observations and theories were shared among the scientific traditions of China, India, Persia, and ultimately Europe. Chinese innovations in metallurgy, particularly in the production of high-quality steel, spread westward. Agricultural techniques and crop species moved in both directions, with Central Asian fruits like grapes and peaches reaching China, while citrus fruits traveled from China to the Mediterranean world. Each of these exchanges transformed daily life in societies thousands of miles apart. The arts flourished through these cross-cultural contacts. Musical instruments traveled along the commercial corridors, creating new hybrid forms and performance traditions. The pear-shaped lute moved from Persia to China, evolving into the Chinese pipa. The Indian sitar likely developed from Middle Eastern predecessors. The 7-day week, originally Babylonian but standardized by the Romans, eventually replaced the 10-day Chinese week through commercial contacts. Visual arts displayed particularly clear evidence of cross-cultural influence. Greco-Buddhist art from Gandhara, modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, combined Indian Buddhist themes with Hellenistic sculptural techniques, creating a distinctive style that influenced Buddhist imagery throughout Asia. Persian textile patterns appeared on Chinese silks, while Chinese motifs later influenced Islamic decorative arts. Artistic techniques traveled alongside motifs. The techniques of glass-making spread from the Mediterranean to China, while paper manufacturing eventually moved westward from China. The culinary traditions of Eurasia were transformed through the exchange of ingredients, cooking techniques, and flavor preferences. Wheat cultivation and bread making spread eastward from the Fertile Crescent, while rice eventually traveled westward from East Asia. Spices became one of the most valuable commodities in long-distance trade, changing flavor profiles in cuisines thousands of miles from their origins. Sugar, originally domesticated in New Guinea and cultivated in India, gradually spread westward to become a staple in Middle Eastern and Mediterranean confectionery. These varied cultural exchanges resulted from the movement of individuals who settled in foreign lands, creating diaspora communities that served as ongoing bridges between civilizations. Sogdian merchants established permanent settlements in China, bringing their culture, language, and religion with them. Persian artisans worked in Tang Dynasty workshops, influencing Chinese metalwork and textile production. Greek sculptors found employment in the Buddhist kingdoms of Central Asia. Indian Buddhist monks established monasteries in China and Central Asia. What made these exchanges possible was not merely the physical movement of goods and people, but the emergence of cosmopolitan attitudes in the major cities, connected by the trade passages. In metropolises like the Chinese imperial capital, Samarkand, and Baghdad, diversity became a source of prestige and cultural vitality. Foreign religions were often tolerated, foreign artisans valued for their skills, and foreign knowledge actively sought out by scholars and rulers. This cosmopolitanism, though never extending to all segments of society and often interrupted by periods of xenophobia, created the conditions for the most extensive pre-modern exchange of ideas in human history. Through these movements of religions, technologies, artistic styles, and knowledge systems, the foundations of a shared Eurasian cultural heritage were established. While each civilization maintained its distinctive character, all were transformed by their participation in this vast exchange network. The legacy of these cultural transmissions continues to shape our modern world. From the global spread of the world's major religions to the mathematical systems we use daily. Behind these enduring influences lay the countless journeys of merchants, pilgrims, and craftspeople, who, in pursuing their individual goals, collectively created one of history's greatest achievements in human communication across cultural boundaries. Dawn broke over the Tang Dynasty capital, illuminating a metropolis unlike any other on Earth. With a population exceeding 1 million souls, this imperial city stood as the world's largest and most cosmopolitan urban center, a fitting eastern terminus for the greatest commercial network of the age. The broad, straight avenues of this meticulously planned city teemed with an astonishing diversity of humanity. Central Asian merchants in colorful robes, Persian astronomers, Indian Buddhist monks, Korean scholars, Japanese diplomats, Turkic mercenaries, and Arab traders, all drawn to the magnetic power of Tang China's cultural and economic might. The rise of the Tang dynasty in 618 AD marked the beginning of what historians consider the golden age of the transcontinental trade passages. Under Emperor Taizong, who ruled until 649, China entered a period of unprecedented prosperity, territorial expansion, and cultural flowering. Unlike some of his predecessors, who had viewed foreign influences with suspicion, Taizong actively embraced international exchange. He welcomed foreign envoys, patronized exotic arts, employed non-Chinese advisors, and promoted policies that facilitated trade with distant lands. This cosmopolitan attitude reflected more than mere curiosity. It represented strategic statecraft. By cultivating diplomatic and commercial ties with the peoples of Central Asia, the Tang emperors sought to secure their western frontiers and gain leverage against potential threats like the Eastern Turks and Tibetans. Trade policy and foreign relations were inseparable in Tang strategic thinking, with commercial passages doubling as diplomatic channels and intelligence networks. Within the Tang capital, the western and eastern markets served as the commercial heart of the city. These vast walled complexes contained specialized sections for different types of merchandise, from local produce to the most exotic luxuries from distant lands. The Western market in particular became the center for international commerce, where Central Asian and Middle Eastern merchants established permanent trading communities. Here, one could purchase Arabian perfumes, Persian silverware, Syrian glassware, Indian cottons and spices, and countless other foreign treasures. These foreign merchant communities received official recognition and protection from the Tang government. Sogdians, Persians, Arabs, Indians, and others were permitted to maintain their distinct cultural identities, religious practices, and legal customs while residing in designated foreign quarters. They built temples to their various deities, established schools that taught their native languages, operated specialized restaurants serving their traditional cuisines, and even maintained their own courts for settling disputes according to their customary laws. The Tang legal code included specific provisions governing the residence and activities of foreign merchants, reflecting their significant presence in Chinese urban life. These regulations were generally pragmatic rather than restrictive, designed to incorporate foreign traders into the imperial administrative system rather than marginalize them. Successful merchants could even receive Chinese government ranks and titles, facilitating their operations within the empire while binding them more closely to Tang authority. The international character of Tang urban centers extended beyond commerce to encompass religion, entertainment, and fashion. Buddhist monasteries housed monks from throughout Asia. Zoroastrian temples, Nestorian churches, and even a mosque in the imperial city served their respective communities. The entertainment districts featured Central Asian musicians, dancers, and acrobats, whose exotic performances captivated Chinese audiences. Court ladies painted their faces white and drew small flower designs on their foreheads in imitation of foreign fashions, while aristocratic young men played polo, a sport imported from Persia. This cultural efflorescence received a severe shock during the middle of the 8th century. The Anlushan Rebellion, beginning in 755, devastated the empire and permanently altered the trajectory of Tang history. General Anlushan, ironically himself of mixed Sogdian and Turkish descent, led a massive uprising that captured both the imperial capital and Luoyang, forcing the emperor to flee. Though eventually suppressed after 8 years of brutal civil war, the rebellion claimed millions of lives, destroyed vast amounts of wealth, and deeply traumatized Chinese society. The Tang dynasty survived, but the cosmopolitan exuberance of its early period gave way to more conservative tendencies. A xenophobic reaction led to restrictions on foreigners and foreign influences. The most dramatic expression of this cultural backlash came in 845, when Emperor Wuzong ordered the suppression of foreign religions, primarily targeting Buddhism, but also affecting Nestorian Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Manichaeism. Thousands of temples and monasteries were destroyed, and foreign clergy were forced to return to secular life. Despite these challenges, the transcontinental commercial networks proved remarkably resilient. Though diminished in volume and altered in character, trade continued through the late Tang period. The difference lay primarily in who controlled the trade. As Chinese government supervision of the western regions weakened, various non-Chinese peoples, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and others, asserted control over key segments of the Central Asian passages, extracting tolls and redirecting trade flows to their advantage. Meanwhile, on the western end of the commercial network, a new power was rising that would transform the character of Eurasian exchange. The Arab conquests of the 7th century, inspired by the new faith of Islam, created a vast empire stretching from Spain to the borders of China. The Umayyad Caliphate, 661 to 750, and its successor, the Abbasid Caliphate, 750 to 1258, unified formerly fragmented territories under a single political authority, establishing unprecedented security for travelers and merchants across much of the network's western and central sections. The Abbasid Caliphate, with its magnificent capital at Baghdad, emerged as the western counterweight to Tang China. Founded in 762 by Caliph al-Mansur, Baghdad was deliberately situated at the confluence of trade routes connecting Arabia, Persia, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. The circular city, with the Caliphal Palace at its center, rapidly grew into a metropolis of hundreds of thousands, drawing merchants and scholars from throughout the known world. Under the greatest Abbasid ruler, Harun al-Rashid, R786-809, Baghdad reached its zenith as a center of commerce, science, and culture. The Caliph dispatched embassies to distant lands, including one to Charlemagne in France and another to the Tang court. These diplomatic missions doubled as commercial ventures, establishing new trade connections and gathering intelligence about distant markets. Harun's court became legendary for its wealth and sophistication, later immortalized in the tales of the Arabian Nights. The Abbasid economy operated on a scale that dwarfed its European contemporaries. Its sophisticated financial instruments facilitated long-distance trade. Letters of credit, SAC, the origin of the English word check. Partnerships, mudaraba, that spread risk among investors, and double-entry bookkeeping systems that tracked complex transactions. Muslim merchants pioneered new commercial techniques that would later be adopted in Europe, including various forms of credit, banking, and insurance. Arabic became the lingua franca of commerce across a vast territory, simplifying communication for merchants traveling between distant markets. A merchant from Córdoba in Spain could converse with colleagues in Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, or Samarkand, using the same language. Despite the thousands of miles separating these cities, this linguistic unity facilitated not only trade, but also the transmission of ideas, technologies, and scientific knowledge throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Islamic religious values shaped commercial practices in distinctive ways. The Quran's explicit approval of legitimate trade, the Prophet Muhammad himself had been a merchant, gave commercial activity a religious sanction, often lacking in other traditions. Islamic law, Sharia, developed detailed regulations governing commerce, contracts, and partnerships. The prohibition on interest, riba, stimulated the development of alternative financing methods that distributed risk and reward between capital providers and entrepreneurs. While Baghdad represented the political center of the Abbasid realm, other cities emerged as specialized nodes in the commercial network. Basra served as the primary port connecting Mesopotamia with the Indian Ocean trade. Damascus remained a manufacturing center, renowned for its textiles and metalwork. Cairo linked the Mediterranean with the Red Sea routes to India. Siraf, on the Persian Gulf, handled trade with East Africa and India. Ray and Nishapur, in Iran, became entrepôts for goods moving between the Middle East and Central Asia. In Central Asia, cities that had already flourished under earlier empires reached new heights of prosperity as intermediaries between the Chinese and Islamic worlds. Samarkand, situated in the fertile Zarafshan Valley, became particularly renowned for its paper manufacturing industry, a technology transferred from China that would eventually transform the Islamic world and later, Europe. The city's artisans also produced glass, textiles, metal goods, and ceramics that were traded throughout Eurasia. Bukhara, with its skyline of minarets and domes, developed into a major intellectual center as well as a commercial hub. Its libraries and madrasas, educational institutions, attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. The city became particularly known for hadith scholarship, the collection and verification of the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, under scholars like Imam al-Bukhari, whose compilation remains among the most authoritative in Islamic tradition. Merv, located in what is now Turkmenistan, may have been the world's most populous city for a brief period during the 12th century. Its sophisticated urban infrastructure included elaborate water management systems, public baths, libraries, and markets specializing in different commodities. The city's strategic location, at the intersection of routes connecting Iran, Central Asia, and China, made it an essential commercial center, while its agricultural hinterland produced cotton, silk, and other valuable crops. The material goods that flowed through this interconnected system were more diverse than ever before. Chinese silk remained important, but was now joined by Chinese porcelain, whose gleaming white surfaces and delicate blue designs captivated consumers throughout Eurasia. Tea from southern China became increasingly popular in Central Asia and parts of the Middle East. Paper, initially a Chinese monopoly, was now produced in Samarkand and other Central Asian cities, gradually making its way westward. From the Islamic world came glassware, brass and bronze work, carpets, and textiles, particularly the tiraz, luxury fabrics bearing calligraphic inscriptions that often included the name of the ruling caliph. India contributed cotton textiles, spices, gemstones, and ivory. The Byzantines exported fine glassware, jewelry, and purple-dyed textiles. From the northern forests came amber, furs, and slaves. African gold, ivory, and exotic animals entered the network through Egypt. This dazzling array of goods passed through countless hands, increasing in value with each transaction. Alongside these physical commodities flowed the currency of knowledge. The Abbasid Caliphate famously patronized the translation of Greek, Persian, Indian, and eventually Chinese texts into Arabic. The House of Wisdom, Bait al-Hikmah, in Baghdad, employed scholars who rendered works on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and other fields into the Arabic language, preserving ancient learning that might otherwise have been lost, and integrating knowledge from diverse civilizations into new syntheses. This intellectual ferment produced remarkable innovations. Muslim astronomers refined the astrolabe and constructed sophisticated observatories. Mathematicians, like al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, developed algebra as a distinct field. Physicians like al-Razi and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, wrote medical encyclopedias that would be studied in Europe for centuries. Geographers produced increasingly accurate maps of the known world, incorporating information gathered from merchants who had traveled to distant lands. Chinese technological innovations continued to move westward. The technique of making paper spread from Samarkand to Baghdad by the late 8th century, and from there throughout the Islamic world, fundamentally transforming the economics of book production and the dissemination of knowledge. Techniques for manufacturing high-fired ceramics slowly diffused westward. The magnetic compass, initially developed in China, eventually reached the Islamic world in Europe. The integration of diverse cultural elements resulted in distinctive aesthetic fusion in arts and architecture. Central Asian textiles incorporated Chinese motifs alongside Persian and Hellenic elements. Chinese painting was influenced by Western perspective techniques via Central Asia. Islamic decorative arts absorbed influences from Byzantine, Persian, and Indian traditions. Music and cuisine similarly reflected the blending of diverse cultural elements as they traveled along the commercial passages. By the mid-9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate began experiencing the same cyclical decline that affected the Tang dynasty. Territorial fragmentation, fiscal crisis, and military challenges from external powers and internal revolts. The golden age of the Silk Road was drawing to a close as both its eastern and western anchors weakened simultaneously. Yet the commercial and cultural networks established during this period would prove remarkably durable, surviving political upheavals to form the foundation for the next great phase of Eurasian interaction under the Mongols. The legacy of this golden age endures in countless aspects of modern life, from the paper we write on to the numerical system we use for calculation, from the transmission of agricultural crops that transform diets across continents to the religious traditions that shape contemporary societies. The cosmopolitan spirit of the Tang capital and Baghdad, cities where diversity was valued and knowledge from all sources was eagerly sought, represents one of history's most inspiring episodes of cross-cultural engagement, a testament to the human capacity for peaceful exchange and mutual enrichment. The thundering hooves of Mongol cavalry echoed across the steppes, deserts, and mountains of Eurasia, heralding a new chapter in the history of the great transcontinental commercial network. What began as the unification of quarreling nomadic tribes under a charismatic leader named Temujin would transform into the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. From the shores of the Pacific to the plains of Eastern Europe, the Mongol conquests would initially bring unprecedented devastation, followed by a remarkable period of security, stability, and renewed prosperity for the ancient trade passages. The story begins in the harsh grasslands of Mongolia, where Temujin, born around 1162, embarked on a lifelong quest to unite the fractious nomadic clans. Through a combination of military genius, political savvy, and ruthless determination, he overcame rivals and unified the Mongol tribes. In 1206, a great assembly of Mongol leaders acclaimed him as Genghis Khan, universal ruler, marking the birth of the Mongol Empire. What followed was one of history's most extraordinary military campaigns, characterized by innovative tactics, psychological warfare, and administrative brilliance. The initial Mongol conquests devastated the established trade network, cities that had flourished as commercial centers for centuries. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, and countless others were systematically destroyed when they resisted Mongol demands for submission. Contemporary accounts describe the utter obliteration of once magnificent urban centers. The Persian chronicler Juvaini wrote of the conquest of Merv. They drove all the people, women and men, out onto the plain. They divided them in accordance with their usual custom into hundreds and thousands to be put to the sword. No one escaped. Yet destruction was not the ultimate Mongol objective. Genghis Khan and his successors understood that ruling settled populations required different approaches than leading nomadic warriors. They adapted their governance strategies accordingly, particularly after the initial conquest phase. While cities that resisted were razed, those that submitted peacefully often received favorable treatment. The Mongols recruited administrators, artisans, and intellectuals from conquered peoples to serve their growing empire, creating a remarkably diverse imperial elite. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, eventually forming four major Khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, and the Yuan dynasty in China. While these divisions created distinct political entities, they maintained strong familial, cultural, and commercial ties. For nearly a century, the Mongol elite shared a common identity that transcended the administrative boundaries of the separate khanates. This unprecedented political unification of virtually the entire length of the ancient trade passages created what historians call a Mongol peace, a period when merchants could travel from the Black Sea to the Yellow Sea under a single political authority. The Mongols, recognizing the economic benefits of commerce, actively promoted trade throughout their domains. As nomads with limited manufacturing capabilities of their own, they depended on trade to acquire the goods of settled civilizations, giving them a vested interest in the network's smooth functioning. The Mongols invested heavily in trade infrastructure. They constructed and maintained caravanserais at regular intervals across Central Asia, providing secure lodging for merchants and their goods. They cleared roads, built bridges, and established ferries at river crossings. They introduced standardized weights and measures throughout their territories, simplifying commercial transactions across cultural boundaries. Most importantly, they established an unprecedented level of security on the roads, severely punishing banditry and theft within their domains. The most innovative contribution of the Mongols to Eurasian exchange was the development of the YAM system, a sophisticated network of postal stations and relay messengers that stretched across the empire. At its height, this system included approximately 1,500 postal stations, spaced about 30 miles apart, a day's journey on horseback. Each station maintained a supply of horses, food, and accommodation for official messengers, unauthorized travelers. A messenger could cover 250 miles per day by changing horses at these stations, a speed unmatched until the advent of railroad travel. While primarily designed for government communications, the YAM system benefited merchants as well. Travelers could move safely and rapidly through Mongol territory, and information about market conditions, political developments, and potential threats could spread with unprecedented speed. The system facilitated both the physical movement of goods and the transmission of commercial intelligence, creating a more integrated Eurasian market than had ever existed before. To further encourage commerce, the Mongols instituted the paisa, also called jurage, a tablet of gold, silver, or wood that served as a passport and safe conduct for travelers. Bearing the seal of the Khan and written in multiple languages, these tablets granted the bearer access to the YAM system and protection throughout Mongol territory. Contemporary accounts describe how merchants carrying the paisa received escort, provisions, and assistance from local Mongol authorities. The most valuable paisa, made of gold and often adorned with pearls, conveyed almost diplomatic status on their bearers. The Mongol rulers also developed sophisticated financial instruments to facilitate trade. During the Yuan dynasty in China, Kublai Khan introduced paper money, backed by silk and precious metals, creating a stable currency for a vast territory. The Ilkhanate experimented with similar monetary innovations. Bills of exchange allowed merchants to deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another, eliminating the need to transport large amounts of precious metals across dangerous territory. These financial innovations reduced the costs and risks of long-distance trade. The Mongol elite displayed remarkable religious tolerance by medieval standards, which further facilitated cross-cultural exchange. Though eventually converting to Islam, Buddhism, or other faiths of their subjects, the early Mongol rulers adhered to their traditional shamanistic beliefs, while showing interest in all religions. Genghis Khan exempted religious leaders, Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, and others, from taxation. Religious communities could practice freely, as long as they prayed for the Khan's well-being and did not interfere with Mongol rule. This religious openness had profound implications for cultural exchange. Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist communities flourished throughout the empire, often in close proximity to one another. Religious buildings of different faiths stood side by side in Mongol capitals. Religious scholars of various traditions engaged in debates at the Mongol court, sponsored by Khans curious about theological questions. This environment of relative tolerance enabled the movement of religious ideas alongside commercial goods. No account of the Mongol era would be complete without the remarkable journey of Marco Polo. Setting out from Venice in 1271, the young merchant accompanied his father and uncle on a trading mission that would keep him in Mongol-ruled China for nearly 2 decades. Serving in the court of Kublai Khan, Marco traveled extensively throughout the Yuan Empire, observing its cities, customs, and commercial practices. His account, dictated after his return to Europe in 1295, introduced many Europeans to the wonders of the East, inspiring future explorers and traders. Though some scholars question aspects of Marco Polo's narrative, his detailed descriptions of paper money, coal burning, the imperial postal system, and other Chinese innovations unknown in Europe lend credibility to his account. His text reflects the perspective of a merchant, focusing on trade goods, commercial practices, and urban amenities, rather than political or military affairs. This commercial emphasis makes his book particularly valuable for understanding the economic dimensions of the transcontinental exchange during this era of unified rule. Marco Polo was exceptional in the length of his stay in China, but he was far from the only European to travel the eastern trade routes during this period. Franciscan missionaries, like John of Plano Carpini and William of Rubruck, journeyed to the Mongol court in the mid-13th century, leaving detailed written accounts. Merchants from Italian city-states established trading outposts in Black Sea ports, the Crimea, and Central Asia. Genoese and Venetian trade networks extended deep into Mongol territory, connecting European markets with Asian goods. A particularly remarkable traveler of this era was Rabban Salma, a Turkic Nestorian Christian monk who traveled from Beijing to Europe as an ambassador of the Ilkhanate. His journey, a reverse mirror of Marco Polo's, took him to Constantinople, Naples, Rome, Paris, and Bordeaux. Between 1287 and 1288, he celebrated Mass with Pope Nicholas IV and met with European monarchs like Philip IV of France and Edward I of England. His journey symbolizes the unprecedented connectivity of Eurasia under Mongol rule. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveler of the 14th century, also benefited from the relative security of the Mongol realms during his extraordinary journeys across Asia, Africa, and Europe. His travels took him through the territories of the Golden Horde and Chagatai Khanate, and he left detailed descriptions of the commercial cities along his route. His observations of paper money, postal stations, and commercial practices corroborate many aspects of Marco Polo's earlier account. The volume and diversity of goods exchanged during this era of transcontinental security exceeded all previous periods. Chinese silk and porcelain continued to flow westward in ever-increasing quantities. The blue and white porcelain that would later become synonymous with Chinese ceramic art, developed during the Yuan dynasty, in response to Middle Eastern tastes, incorporating cobalt pigments imported from Persia. This fusion of Chinese manufacturing techniques with West Asian aesthetic preferences exemplifies the cross-cultural character of Mongol-era commerce. Technologies transferred more efficiently than ever before. Printing technology, long established in China, spread westward through Mongol territories, reaching Persia and eventually Europe. Gunpowder and its associated weapons diffused from China to the Islamic world and Europe during this period. Agricultural innovations also traveled along the trade routes. New fruit varieties, irrigation techniques, and cultivation methods transformed food production across Eurasia. The Mongol era witnessed unprecedented scholarly and scientific exchange. Persian and Arab astronomers worked in Chinese observatories, while Chinese mathematical and calendrical knowledge influenced Middle Eastern science. Medical knowledge from Chinese, Indian, Persian, and Greek traditions circulated throughout the empire, synthesized in multilingual medical compendia. The famous Persian physician, Rashid al-Din, serving the Ilkhanate, compiled comparative studies of Chinese and Islamic medicine. Artistic motifs and techniques flowed freely across cultural boundaries. Chinese motifs like the lotus, peony, and dragon appeared in Persian miniatures and textiles. Persian decorative styles influenced Chinese painting and ceramics. The distinctive blue and white porcelain that became synonymous with Ming Dynasty art actually developed during the Yuan period, using cobalt pigment imported from Persia. This cultural fusion created new aesthetic traditions that would outlast the Mongol era itself. Architecture similarly reflected cross-cultural exchange. The famous Mongol capital at Karakoram contained Buddhist temples, Muslim mosques, and Christian churches, often constructed by artisans brought from distant conquered territories. In China, Islamic architectural elements appeared in traditional Chinese buildings. In Persia and Central Asia, East Asian influences could be seen in decorative elements and construction techniques. These architectural hybrids symbolize the unprecedented cultural mixing of the period. The Mongol era witnessed not only the movement of goods and ideas, but also large-scale population transfers. The Mongols systematically relocated skilled artisans and intellectuals from conquered territories to serve imperial needs. Persian astronomers worked in Chinese observatories. Central Asian Muslim administrators served in the Yuan government. Chinese siege engineers assisted in Mongol campaigns in the Middle East. These forced migrations created diaspora communities that became important agents of cultural transmission. For all its achievements, this era of transcontinental exchange contained the seeds of its own dissolution. The separate Khanartes gradually lost their sense of common identity, adopting the religions and cultures of their subjects. The Ilkhuns converted to Islam. The Yuan embraced aspects of Chinese governance, and the Golden Horde adopted Turkic language and Islamic faith. Religious differences created tensions between the formerly united branches of the Mongol family. By the mid-14th century, the Khanate operated as independent powers, sometimes in conflict with one another. Internal succession disputes plagued each Khanate, weakening central authority and creating opportunities for subject peoples to assert greater autonomy. Economic policies that initially stimulated trade, such as the extensive use of paper money without sufficient backing, eventually led to inflation and financial instability, particularly in the Yuan dynasty. The enormous costs of maintaining the imperial infrastructure, from the yam system to military garrisons, strained resources and necessitated heavy taxation. The final blow to this unified commercial system came not from political or economic challenges, but from a biological catastrophe. the Black Death. This devastating pandemic, which killed approximately 1/3 of Europe's population, likely originated in East Asia and spread rapidly along the very trade routes that the Mongols had secured and developed. Merchant ships and caravans unknowingly transported not only valuable goods, but also infected rats and fleas carrying the deadly bacteria. Contemporary accounts from affected regions describe apocalyptic scenes as the pandemic swept through densely populated cities. The Florentine writer Boccaccio wrote that fathers abandoned their children, wives their husbands, brother his brother, while Islamic chroniclers described entire villages and urban districts left without inhabitants. The economic impact proved equally severe, disrupting production, trade, and agriculture throughout Eurasia. The disease spread with unprecedented speed due to the very interconnectedness that had made the Mongol commercial system so successful. A merchant infected in Kaffa on the Black Sea could carry the disease to Constantinople before showing symptoms. Caravans could transport infected rats across Central Asia to China. Naval vessels could bring the plague from Black Sea ports to Mediterranean cities. The highly integrated Eurasian commercial networks had created an ideal environment for pandemic transmission. The demographic collapse resulting from the Black Death dramatically reduced demand for luxury goods, undermining the economic foundation of the transcontinental trade. Labor shortages following the pandemic led to increased wages for workers, but devastating losses for merchant elites. Agricultural production declined as farmland lay fallow for lack of laborers. Tax revenues plummeted, further weakening the already strained Mongol administrations. By the late 14th century, the Mongol Empire had fragmented beyond recognition. In China, the Yuan dynasty fell to the Ming in 1368. In Persia, the Ilkhanate had already collapsed into competing regional powers. The Golden Horde fractured into smaller khanates that would eventually succumb to the rising power of Moscow. Only in Central Asia did Mongol rule persist longer, with Timur, Tamerlane, claiming Genghis Khan's legacy while building his own empire centered on Samarkand. The commercial networks established during this era of unified rule proved more durable than the political structures that had facilitated them. Trade continued along the ancient passages, though at reduced volume and with greater risks and costs. The specialized merchant communities, Phoenicians, Genoese, Armenians, Jews, Arabs, Persians, and others, maintained their operations, adapting to the changed political landscape. The knowledge, technologies, and cultural elements exchanged during the Mongol era had become permanently integrated into the societies they had reached. The legacy of the Mongol period for the transcontinental exchange network was paradoxical. On one hand, the Mongol conquests initially devastated many of the urban centers that had been crucial nodes in the commercial system. On the other hand, the subsequent era of stability created conditions for more extensive and voluminous trade than ever before. The Mongols were both destroyers and creators, tearing down existing structures only to build new and often more efficient ones. Perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the Mongol era was the unprecedented level of information exchange between distant civilizations. Europeans gained more accurate knowledge of Asia than they had ever possessed before. Chinese learned about European and Middle Eastern technologies and scientific concepts. The circulation of practical knowledge, from Persian astronomical instruments to Chinese printing techniques, from Arab algebra to Eurasian shipbuilding methods, accelerated technological development throughout the connected world. Marco Polo's account, despite its limitations and occasional exaggerations, exemplifies this information exchange. His descriptions of paper money, coal burning, efficient tax collection, and postal services introduced Europeans to Chinese innovations they had never imagined. While immediate practical applications of this knowledge were limited, the broadening of European intellectual horizons would later contribute to the experimental attitude of the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. The Mongol era represented both the zenith of the ancient Eurasian exchange system and the beginning of its transformation. The very success of the transcontinental peace in facilitating East-West contact would ultimately contribute to developments that would render the traditional overland routes less essential. European mariners, inspired partly by Marco Polo's descriptions of Asian wealth, would soon seek direct sea routes to the east, circumventing the complex chain of middlemen that had characterized the old commercial network. As the 14th century drew to a close, the ancient passages linking east and west remained active, but increasingly challenged by political fragmentation, economic disruption, and the emerging maritime alternatives. The Mongol dream of universal empire had faded, but the commercial and cultural connections forged during their remarkable century of dominance had permanently altered the trajectory of world history, leaving an indelible legacy that continues to shape our modern global civilization. The ringing of church bells across Europe announced each new outbreak of the pestilence, a mournful counterpoint to the muezzin's call that echoed over similarly devastated cities from Cairo to Samarkand. The Black Death, which first appeared in the Crimea around 1347, swept across the interconnected Eurasian world with devastating efficiency, following the very commercial arteries that had facilitated centuries of prosperous exchange. By the time its initial fury subsided in the early 1350s, the pandemic had claimed perhaps a third of Europe's population and comparable numbers across the Middle East, Central Asia, and China. This biological catastrophe delivered a severe blow to the transcontinental network that had reached its zenith under Mongol protection. Beyond the immediate human tragedy lay profound economic consequences. Collapsed demand for luxury goods, labor shortages, abandoned agricultural lands, and declining tax revenues. The plague bacterium, unwittingly transported by merchants and their goods, demonstrated the double-edged nature of Eurasian connectivity. The same pathways that had carried silk, spices, and ideas now became vectors for microscopic death. The timing of this pandemic proved particularly consequential, coinciding with the political fragmentation of the Mongol Empire. The Golden Horde, ruling the western steppe regions, had already adopted Islam and grown culturally distant from its Mongol origins. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed entirely following the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335, fragmenting into competing regional dynasties. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia split into eastern and western sections with diverging political trajectories. In China, Mongol rule grew increasingly unstable as natural disasters, economic mismanagement, and native Chinese resistance undermined Yuan dynasty authority. Into this fractured landscape stepped a conqueror whose name would become synonymous with both destruction and splendor. Timur, known to Europeans as Tamerlane. Born in the 1320s near Samarkand, this Turco-Mongol warlord claimed descent from Genghis Khan and embarked on a campaign of conquest that would briefly resurrect the dream of a unified Eurasian empire. Between 1370 and his death in 1405, Timur conquered territories stretching from Delhi to Damascus, from the Aral Sea to Anatolia. Unlike Genghis Khan, whose conquests ultimately facilitated commerce, Timur's campaigns caused lasting damage to the commercial infrastructure of Central and Western Asia. His armies systematically destroyed the irrigation systems of Mesopotamia that had sustained agriculture since Sumerian times. They demolished the commercial centers of the Middle East and India, massacring urban populations and deporting skilled artisans to Samarkand. His conquest of Delhi in 1398 resulted in the slaughter of perhaps 100,000 people in a single day. Damascus, Baghdad, and Aleppo suffered similarly devastating fates. While Timur made his capital at Samarkand into a magnificent showcase of Islamic architecture and patronized arts and sciences, the broader economic impact of his conquests was overwhelmingly negative for transcontinental commerce. The security and stability necessary for long-distance trade vanished. Merchants faced heightened risks and uncertainties. Commercial cities that had taken centuries to develop were depopulated or destroyed entirely. The carefully developed networks of credit, partnership, and trust that had facilitated trade across cultural boundaries collapsed amid the chaos of repeated invasions. Timur's empire disintegrated rapidly after his death, as his sons and grandsons fought for control of various territories. The resulting political fragmentation created additional barriers to trade, with multiple authorities demanding tolls, taxes, and customs duties along formerly unified routes. Merchants now had to negotiate passage through numerous competing jurisdictions, each seeking to extract maximum profits from the diminished flow of commerce. While Central Asia suffered from these political convulsions, equally significant changes were unfolding at the eastern terminus of the ancient network. The Ming dynasty, established in 1368 after the overthrow of Mongol rule, initially maintained an outward-looking commercial policy. Early Ming emperors dispatched the remarkable treasure fleets commanded by Admiral Zheng He, whose 7 voyages between 1405 and 1433 reached as far as East Africa, demonstrating China's capacity for maritime dominance. However, this brief period of Chinese maritime expansion soon gave way to more restrictive policies. After 1433, court factions opposed to naval expeditions gained the upper hand, arguing that such ventures drained the treasury while providing insufficient benefits. The treasure fleets were disbanded, shipyards fell into disrepair, and maritime technology stagnated. While private Chinese merchants continued overseas trade, they did so without state support and in the face of increasing restrictions. The Ming government gradually implemented a more controlled approach to foreign commerce, known as the tributary trade system. Foreign merchants could trade only at designated ports at specified times, and after acknowledging Chinese imperial supremacy through ritual kowtowing and tribute offerings. This system provided the Ming court with political prestige, while allowing it to regulate the flow of goods and people across its borders. For practical purposes, it made trade with China more complicated, more expensive, and less attractive to foreign merchants. This inward turn reflected deeper shifts in Chinese strategic priorities. The primary security concern for Ming rulers was not controlling distant trade routes, but defending against Mongol threats from the north. They invested enormous resources in renovating and extending the Great Wall, rather than maintaining the overland commercial corridors that had connected China to Central Asia. The Hexi Corridor and other Western approaches received less attention and protection than during earlier dynasties. At the western end of the ancient network, another imperial power was rising with momentous consequences for Eurasian exchange. The Ottoman Turks, emerging from Anatolia, conquered Constantinople in 1453, extinguishing the 1,000-year Byzantine Empire and controlling access between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. By the early 16th century, Ottoman territories encompassed most of the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe, territories that had been essential links in the transcontinental commercial chain. The Ottoman conquest initially disrupted established trading patterns, particularly for Italian merchants who had developed special relationships with Byzantine authorities. However, the Ottomans soon recognized the value of facilitating and taxing commerce through their territories. Under Mehmed II and his successors, Constantinople was revitalized as a commercial center, with new markets, caravanserais, and port facilities. The Ottomans generally protected foreign merchants operating within their domains, though they extracted substantial revenues through customs duties and required permits. Yet even as the Ottomans consolidated control over traditional trade centers, so their expansion created strategic challenges for European commercial interests. Phoenician and Genoese merchants, who had dominated trade with the East for centuries, found their privileged positions threatened by Ottoman policies favoring Muslim traders. The flow of Asian goods to Europe remained substantial, but European merchants faced higher costs and greater uncertainties when operating in Ottoman territories. These changing conditions at both ends of the ancient commercial network, Ming isolationism in the East and Ottoman control in the West, might have led to adjustments and adaptations within the traditional system. However, a more fundamental challenge was emerging that would ultimately render the ancient overland passages secondary to newer maritime connections: European oceanic exploration. The Portuguese led this maritime revolution, driven by a combination of commercial ambition, religious zeal, and technological innovation. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, in the early 15th century, Portuguese captains began methodically exploring the African coastline, improving ship designs and navigation techniques with each voyage. Their ultimate goal was to circumvent Muslim-controlled trade routes and establish direct contact with the sources of Asian wealth. This quest reached its first major milestone in 1488, when Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope at Africa's southern tip. A decade later, Vasco da Gama completed the journey to India, reaching Calicut in May 1498 and returning to Portugal with a cargo of spices that yielded a staggering 6,000% profit. This successful voyage demonstrated the commercial viability of the long sea route to Asia, bypassing the complex chain of middlemen that had characterized the traditional network. The Portuguese quickly leveraged this breakthrough, establishing a chain of fortified trading posts from East Africa to the Spice Islands, modern Indonesia, Macau, and Japan. Their strategy emphasized naval power rather than territorial control, using superior ships and gunpowder weapons to dominate key maritime choke points and extract favorable trading terms from local rulers. The Estado de India, as this maritime empire was known, fundamentally altered the economics of Eurasian trade. When direct comparison became possible, the cost advantages of maritime shipping over land transport proved decisive. A Venetian merchant bringing pepper from Alexandria to Venice in the traditional manner paid approximately 70% of the pepper's value in transportation and transaction costs. The Portuguese, shipping directly from Cochin in India to Lisbon, incurred costs of only about 30%. This differential meant that even with the longer journey time by sea, European merchants could deliver Asian goods more cheaply via the Cape route than through the Middle East. The Spanish soon joined the maritime competition, sponsoring Christopher Columbus's attempt to reach Asia by sailing westward across the Atlantic. Though Columbus encountered the Americas instead, the Spanish quickly established their own global maritime empire. The circumnavigation of the globe by Ferdinand Magellan's expedition in 1519 to 1522 symbolized the new reality of oceanic connectivity. Even as the excessive costs and casualties of this pioneering voyage demonstrated its practical limitations, By the mid-16th century, a significant portion of the luxury goods that had once traversed the ancient pathways connecting China and the Mediterranean now moved by sea. Portuguese carracks and galleons carried Chinese silk and porcelain, Indian cotton and spices, and Southeast Asian aromatics directly to European ports. The overland routes continued to function, but handled a diminishing share of east-west commerce as merchants and consumers adjusted to the new economic realities. This maritime revolution had profound implications for the societies that had specialized in facilitating overland trade. Cities like Venice and Genoa, whose prosperity had depended on their role as gateways for Asian goods entering Europe, faced relative decline as trade shifted to Atlantic ports like Lisbon, Seville, and later Amsterdam and London. The commercial cities of the Middle East and Central Asia suffered even more dramatic reversals as they found themselves increasingly marginalized in the emerging global economy. The gradual eclipse of the ancient overland network should not be seen as a sudden collapse, but rather as a centuries-long process of adaptation and realignment. Even as maritime connections gained prominence, certain high-value, low-volume luxury goods continued to move along traditional channels. Regional commerce within Central Asia remained vibrant, with cities like Bukhara and Samarkand serving local and regional markets even as their role in intercontinental trade diminished. Overland routes linking China with Russia and the Ottoman Empire maintained significance for specific commodities and diplomatic exchanges. Moreover, the cultural and intellectual connections established during the heyday of the traditional network proved remarkably durable. Religious communities, scholarly traditions, artistic styles, and technological knowledge that had spread along the commercial arteries remained embedded in the societies they had reached. The legacy of centuries of cross-cultural exchange continued to shape developments in philosophy, science, art, and literature, long after the economic foundations of the network had eroded. By the dawn of the 17th century, the ancient pattern of Eurasian exchange had been fundamentally transformed. The age of European maritime empires had begun, initiating the process that would eventually create a truly global exchange network, incorporating the Americas and Oceania alongside the connected lands of Afro-Eurasia. The ancient passages that had carried silk from China to Rome, Buddhism from India to East Asia, and countless other material and cultural treasures between distant civilizations now functioned primarily as regional trade routes. Their transcontinental significance diminished, but never entirely forgotten. The declining practical importance of the overland network coincided with the mythologization of the Silk Road in European imagination. As direct contact with China increased, Europeans developed more accurate knowledge of silk production, geography, and Chinese society, but simultaneously romanticized the ancient trade routes as pathways of mystery and adventure. Marco Polo's account, first printed in 1477, found new readers fascinated by his descriptions of exotic lands and peoples. The ancient commercial network, even as it faded as an economic reality, began its afterlife as a powerful cultural symbol of connectivity and exchange between East and West. Long before European mariners ventured beyond familiar shores, the waters of the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Persian Gulf carried a vibrant maritime trade that complemented and sometimes rivaled the more famous overland passages. This aquatic network, sometimes called the Maritime Silk Road, linked the great civilizations of East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, and East Africa through seaborne commerce. Governed by the rhythm of monsoon winds rather than the challenges of mountain passes and desert crossings, These sea lanes fostered their own distinctive patterns of exchange, specialized port cities, and seafaring technologies. The origins of these maritime connections predate written history. Archaeological evidence indicates that seafarers were crossing the Taiwan Strait by 5,000 years ago. Bronze drums, manufactured in northern Vietnam, have been found throughout maritime Southeast Asia, suggesting extensive trade networks by the first millennium before the Common Era. Ancient Chinese accounts mention voyages to islands called Yichu and Lanfang, likely referring to Taiwan or the Philippines, while early Indian texts describe trading expeditions to Southeast Asian lands called Suvarnabhumi and Suvarnadvipa, names that evoke the gold-producing regions of the Malay Peninsula and Indonesian archipelago. These early maritime ventures remained relatively limited in scale until advances in shipbuilding and navigation enabled longer, safer voyages across open waters. By the time of the Han Dynasty, Chinese merchants were venturing south along the coast to Vietnam and beyond, while South Indian mariners were crossing the Bay of Bengal to reach Southeast Asian ports. The goods exchanged in this early maritime trade included many of the same luxury items that traveled the overland routes: silk, spices, precious metals, and gemstones, but also incorporated bulkier commodities like ceramics, timber, and grain that proved impractical for camel caravans. Maritime commerce accelerated dramatically during the Tang Dynasty, coinciding with the golden age of the overland network. Chinese ships now regularly visited ports throughout Southeast Asia, while Persian and Arab vessels ventured as far as Guangzhou, Canton. The Tang established maritime customs offices at major ports like Guangzhou, Hangzhou, and Yangzhou to regulate and tax this burgeoning trade. These cities developed large foreign quarters where merchants from distant lands established semi-permanent communities, complete with their own places of worship, markets, and legal arrangements. The monsoon wind pattern dictated the rhythm of this maritime commerce. From April to August, the southwest monsoon enabled ships to sail from Arabia and India to China. From November to February, the northeast monsoon facilitated the return journey. This natural cycle created a predictable schedule for departures and arrivals, with ships spending several months in foreign ports waiting for favorable winds. During these extended stays, merchants not only conducted business, but also exchanged religious ideas, cultural practices, and technologies with local populations. The prominence of the maritime routes grew substantially after the fall of the Tang Dynasty, when Chinese attention shifted increasingly toward the sea. The Song Dynasty, having lost control of the northern overland routes to nomadic peoples, actively promoted maritime commerce as an alternative revenue source. They developed China's first permanent navy, improved harbor facilities, and established maritime trade superintendencies in major ports. The southern Song, capital of Hangzhou, became a magnificent maritime commercial center, described by Marco Polo as the finest and most splendid city in the world. Song Dynasty technological innovations transformed maritime capabilities. Chinese shipwrights developed the stern post rudder, watertight compartments, and multiple masts with adjustable sails, creating vessels far more maneuverable and seaworthy than their predecessors. The Chinese mariner's compass, first employed for navigation during this period, revolutionized seafaring by enabling captains to determine direction without reference to landmarks or celestial bodies, a crucial advantage during overcast conditions or on the open ocean. The junk, China's distinctive ship design with its high stern, flat bottom, and battened sails, emerged as the dominant vessel type in East Asian waters. These ships came in various sizes, from small coastal craft to massive treasure ships that would later carry Admiral Zheng He's expeditions across the Indian Ocean. Their compartmentalized hulls could carry diverse cargoes while providing safety in case of leaks, and their adjustable sails allowed efficient operation with minimal crew. These innovative vessels gave Chinese merchants significant advantages in maritime commerce. While the Chinese dominated the eastern sections of the maritime network, the western portions saw the rise of successive trading powers. During the early centuries of the Common Era, merchants from the Greco-Roman world sailed from Egyptian Red Sea ports to India, as documented in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. The Aksumite kingdom in Ethiopia and Sassanid Persia later controlled significant portions of this western trade. Following the rise of Islam, Arab and Persian Muslim merchants gradually established commercial hegemony throughout the Indian Ocean, forming a maritime trade diaspora that stretched from East Africa to Southeast Asia. Between these eastern and western maritime spheres lay the crucial Strait of Malacca, a narrow passage between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra that serves as the primary shipping channel between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Control of this strategic choke point brought enormous wealth to successive Southeast Asian empires. The Srivijaya Empire dominated the strait from the 7th to 13th centuries, followed by the Majapahit Empire and later the Malacca Sultanate. These states derived their power not from large territories or armies, but from their ability to regulate and profit from maritime commerce passing through their waters. Specialized port cities emerged throughout the network to facilitate exchange between different maritime trading zones. Places like Palembang, Malacca, Hormuz, and Kilwa functioned as entrepôts where goods were transferred between different regional circuits. Currencies were exchanged, and merchants from diverse backgrounds negotiated deals. These cities typically operated with considerable autonomy from inland political authorities, developing cosmopolitan cultures and pragmatic legal systems designed to accommodate foreign traders. Religious ideas spread extensively along these maritime passages. Muslim, Arab, and Persian merchants established Islam throughout maritime Southeast Asia, gradually converting local rulers who saw advantages in joining the international Muslim commercial community. Chinese merchants brought Confucian cultural norms and sometimes Buddhist beliefs to overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. Hindu and Buddhist influences from India had already transformed the religious landscape of much of Southeast Asia. During earlier centuries of maritime contact, the diversity of goods exchanged along the maritime Silk Road exceeded even that of its overland counterpart. Chinese silks and porcelains traveled west, while Indian cotton textiles, Arabian incense, and African ivory moved east. Southeast Asian spices, especially cloves, nutmeg, and mace from the remote Maluku Islands, commanded extraordinary prices in both Chinese and European markets. Exotic animals, medicinal herbs, tropical hardwoods, and precious metals circulated throughout the network, enriching the material cultures of participating societies. The most remarkable chapter in the history of the maritime Silk Road began in the early 15th century, with the treasure voyages commanded by Admiral Zheng He. Between 1405 and 1433, this Chinese Muslim eunuch led 7 massive naval expeditions through Southeast Asian waters to India, the Persian Gulf, and the East African coast. The scale of these ventures dwarfed contemporary European explorations. Zheng He's fleet included ships measuring 400 feet in length, several times larger than Columbus's vessels, and the entire expedition comprised up to 300 ships and 28,000 men. These voyages combined multiple objectives, establishing Chinese diplomatic dominance through an elaborate tributary system, conducting trade, collecting exotic treasures and curiosities for the Ming court, gathering intelligence about distant lands, and projecting imperial power throughout the Indian Ocean world. The expeditions typically involved peaceful ceremonies, where foreign rulers acknowledged Chinese suzerainty and offered tribute gifts, receiving valuable Chinese goods in return. However, the treasure fleets also engaged in occasional military actions against pirates or uncooperative local authorities. The abrupt termination of these voyages after 1433, followed by the Ming dynasty's increasing restrictions on maritime activity, represents one of history's great counterfactual junctures. Had China maintained its naval supremacy and maritime engagement, the subsequent history of global power relations might have unfolded very differently. Instead, the Ming turned inward, just as European powers began their own maritime expansions, ultimately allowing Western nations to dominate the very trade routes that China had once controlled. The Portuguese arrival in Asian waters, marked by Vasco da Gama's journey to Calicut in 1498, introduced a new and disruptive force into the ancient maritime networks. Unlike previous participants in the Indian Ocean trade, who generally operated within consensual frameworks that balanced competition with cooperation, the Portuguese employed naval firepower to impose advantageous trading arrangements. Their strategy centered on controlling key maritime choke points through a network of fortified bases: Hormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, Malacca commanding the crucial strait, Macau providing access to the China trade. Portuguese carracks, though smaller than the largest Chinese vessels, carried formidable artillery that transformed maritime power dynamics. Traditional trading ships in the Indian Ocean had carried minimal armaments, as the commercial system had operated largely without naval warfare. The Portuguese armed trading model, where commercial vessels doubled as warships, gave them disproportionate influence despite their limited numbers. Later, European entrants, the Spanish, Dutch, English, and French, would adopt and refine this approach to carve out their own maritime empires. The impact of European intervention varied across the maritime Silk Road. In some regions, such as the Spice Islands, traditional trading patterns were completely disrupted by European monopolistic practices and forced cultivation systems. Elsewhere, Asian merchants adapted to the new circumstances, sometimes forming alliances with European powers, or finding niches where they maintained competitive advantages. Particularly successful were diaspora trading communities like the Parsis, Gujaratis, and overseas Chinese, who often served as middlemen between European companies and local producers. The Portuguese and subsequent European powers established direct maritime connections between Asia and Europe via the Cape of Good Hope, and later, between Asia and the Americas across the Pacific. These new global linkages gradually transformed the ancient maritime Silk Road from a largely self-contained Asian trading system into components of an emerging worldwide network. Ports that had primarily served regional commerce now became nodes in truly global supply chains, handling goods destined for consumers on distant continents. By the 18th century, the traditional maritime passages had been fully incorporated into the European-dominated global trading system. Spanish galleons connected Manila with Acapulco, carrying Asian goods to the Americas and American silver to China. The English East India Company shipped Chinese tea to Britain and Indian cotton textiles to Africa and the Americas. Dutch vessels brought Indonesian spices to Amsterdam for redistribution throughout Europe. The ancient patterns of Asian maritime trade had not disappeared, but had been subordinated to and integrated within a new economic order structured around European interests. The legacy of the maritime Silk Road endures in numerous aspects of our modern world. The multicultural port cities it fostered, Singapore, Hong Kong, Mumbai, Dubai, remain vital hubs in today's global economy. The diverse cuisines of coastal regions throughout Asia and East Africa reflect centuries of maritime cultural exchange through their distinctive combinations of ingredients and techniques. Religious landscapes spanning from East Africa to Indonesia bear the imprint of conversions that followed trading connections. Even the contemporary maritime shipping industry, with its specialized ports, international legal frameworks, and interconnected supply chains, builds upon foundations established along these ancient routes. In recent decades, rising Asian economies, particularly China, have invoked the maritime Silk Road as both historical precedent and metaphor for their growing engagement with the wider world. China's Belt and Road Initiative explicitly references both the overland and maritime dimensions of the ancient trading networks as models for contemporary infrastructure development and economic integration. This conscious recall of the ancient passages suggests that their significance extends beyond mere historical interest to encompass enduring aspirations for Eurasian connectivity and prosperity. The story of the maritime Silk Road complements and complicates the narrative of its overland counterpart. Together, they reveal a more complete picture of the complex exchanges that connected distant civilizations, facilitated cultural encounters, and shaped the development of human societies across the Afro-Eurasian world. The maritime dimension reminds us that the ancient networks operated in multiple environments, adapted to diverse challenges, and created varied patterns of interaction, a flexibility and multiplicity that characterized globalization long before the modern era. Behind the grand historical narratives of imperial conquests, religious transmissions, and commercial innovations lies the human dimension of the ancient network, the daily experiences of the countless individuals who made their lives along these storied passages. From the merchants who guided camel caravans across treacherous terrain, to the innkeepers who offered them shelter, from the farmers who fed traveling strangers, to the artisans who crafted goods for distant markets, these ordinary people collectively sustained the extraordinary connections that link distant civilizations. The merchant's life embodied both tremendous opportunity and extreme risk. Most traders specialized in particular segments of the network, rather than traversing its entire length. A Sogdian merchant might travel the routes between Samarkand and Chang'an, while a Persian counterpart worked the passages from Mesopotamia to Central Asia. These regional specializations allowed traders to develop deep knowledge of local languages, customs, and market conditions, essential intelligence for successful commerce. Organization proved crucial for merchants attempting long-distance trade. Family partnerships represented the most common business structure, with male relatives stationed in different cities to form a commercial network bound by kinship ties. A merchant house might position one brother in Bukhara, another in Merv, and a third in Kashgar, creating a chain of trusted agents who could receive shipments, negotiate sales, and transmit profits. These family networks often spanned generations, with sons apprenticed to the business from childhood and eventually taking over from their fathers. For journeys through difficult terrain, merchants typically formed caravans, temporary alliances for mutual protection and assistance. A typical caravan might include several merchant groups, each with their own goods and pack animals, traveling together under the leadership of a caravan guide or bashi. This experienced professional knew the routes intimately, including the locations of water sources, dangerous passes, and safe camping grounds. The bashi negotiated with local authorities for passage rights, organized guards, and resolved disputes among travelers. The choice of pack animals depended on terrain and climate. Bactrian camels, with their 2 humps and thick fur, excelled in the cold deserts and mountains of Central Asia. Dromedaries, with single humps and leaner builds, performed better in the hot deserts of Arabia and North Africa. Horses provided faster transportation for valuable, lightweight goods and messages. Mules offered sure-footed transport through mountain passages. Yaks served at the highest elevations in the Tibetan Plateau. Each animal required specialized knowledge regarding feeding, loading, and care, creating distinct vocational niches for animal handlers along the routes. Communication across linguistic boundaries presented a constant challenge. Major trading centers like Chang'an, Samarkand, or Baghdad had resident translator communities who facilitated transactions between merchants speaking different languages. Elsewhere, traders relied on crude trade pigeons, gesture, or multilingual intermediaries. Successful merchants often acquired working knowledge of multiple languages. Historical sources mention Sogdian traders who could converse in 6 or more tongues, an essential skill in their role as cross-cultural middlemen. The management of currencies and values posed another practical difficulty. Silver dirhams from the Islamic world, copper cash from China, gold bezants from Byzantium, and uncoined precious metals all circulated along various segments of the network. Money changers in major markets offered conversion services, but often at unfavorable rates. Merchants had to master complex calculations involving different weight standards, purity assessments, and fluctuating exchange values. Many traders carried small scales and touchstones to verify the weight and quality of coins received in distant markets. Risk management strategies evolved to address the inherent dangers of long-distance trade. Letters of credit allowed merchants to deposit funds in one city and withdraw equivalent amounts elsewhere, reducing the need to transport large quantities of precious metals. Commenda partnerships spread risk among multiple investors, with sleeping partners providing capital, while traveling partners contributed labor and expertise. Some merchants diversified their shipments across multiple caravans, ensuring that the loss of a single group would not prove financially ruinous. Religious faith accompanied merchants on their journeys, providing both spiritual comfort and practical community connections. Muslim traders found mosques and fellow believers in cities throughout Central Asia and China. Christian merchants, particularly Nestorians and Armenians, maintained churches and trading colonies along the routes. Jewish merchants benefited from the network of Jewish communities stretching from Spain to China, where they could observe religious practices, obtain kosher food, and secure lodging with co-religionists. These religious affiliations often doubled as business networks, with houses of worship serving as places to exchange commercial information and form partnerships. The physical dangers facing merchants remained considerable despite these adaptive strategies. Bandits plagued remote stretches of the routes, particularly in mountain passes and desert margins, where official authority proved tenuous. Natural hazards claimed many lives. Sandstorms in the Taklamakan Desert, blizzards in the Pamir Mountains, flash floods in arid regions. Disease represented another constant threat, with merchants exposed to unfamiliar pathogens as they traveled between different disease environments. Many traders never returned from their journeys, their fates recorded only in brief mentions in business correspondence. The success of transcontinental commerce depended not only on the merchants who transported goods, but also on the infrastructure that supported their journeys. The caravanserai, a fortified inn, providing secure lodging for travelers and their animals. represented perhaps the most important element of this infrastructure. These structures appeared throughout the network from Anatolia to China, following similar functional designs despite regional architectural variations, typically built as rectangular enclosures with a single defensible entrance. They featured rooms for travelers around a central courtyard, with stables for animals along the perimeter walls. Entering a caravanserai at dusk, a wary merchant would find a microcosm of the network's diversity. In the central courtyard, camel drivers watered and fed their animals, while comparing information about conditions ahead. In small chambers along the walls, merchants from different regions secured their goods and prepared simple meals. In the common areas, travelers shared news from distant cities, political developments, market prices, religious events, creating an oral information network that transmitted intelligence across vast distances. Caravanserais provided more than merely shelter. Many offered specialized services: blacksmiths who could repair metal goods or shoe horses, food vendors selling local provisions, money changers facilitating transactions between different currency zones, and scribes who could prepare commercial documents or write letters home for illiterate travelers. Some larger establishments included prayer rooms accommodating different faiths, bathhouses for ritual and practical cleanliness, and even entertainment in the form of musicians or storytellers. The operation of these essential institutions took various forms. Along major royal roads in the Persian and later Islamic empires, caravanserais often received state funding as public infrastructure, promoting commerce and demonstrating the ruler's concern for trade. Elsewhere, they functioned as private enterprises, generating profit through fees for lodging, secure storage, food, and services. In some regions, religious endowments, Waqf in Islamic territories, supported caravanserais as charitable institutions, particularly along pilgrimage routes. The rhythm of arrival and departure at these way stations followed predictable patterns dictated by the practicalities of travel. Caravans typically departed in the pre-dawn hours, traveling during the cooler parts of the day. They aimed to reach the next caravanserai by late afternoon, allowing time to secure lodging, tend to animals, prepare meals, and conduct any necessary business before nightfall. This rhythm created a distinctive temporal geography along the routes, with predictable flows of travelers and goods through established points in the network. Between these nodes of commercial infrastructure lay diverse settled communities, whose lives became intertwined with the passing trade. Farmers in oasis settlements produced food for local consumption and for sale to travelers: grain, fruits, vegetables, and fodder for animals. Specialization within these agricultural zones often reflected commercial opportunities presented by the trade passages. Orchards of high-value fruits might replace basic grain production. Cotton cultivation could supply local textile workshops producing goods for distant markets. The environmental challenges facing these settled communities often proved formidable. In desert oasis settlements like Dunhuan or Turfan, elaborate irrigation systems channeled meltwater from distant mountains to support agriculture in nearly rainless conditions. These systems required constant maintenance and complex social organization to allocate water rights. The fragility of these environmental adaptations meant that political disruptions or natural disasters could rapidly render once prosperous settlements uninhabitable. Urban centers along the network developed distinctive spatial patterns reflecting their commercial functions. Markets typically occupied central locations, often with specialized sections for different categories of goods. Foreign merchant communities clustered in designated neighborhoods, sometimes with significant autonomy, regarding internal governance. Religious buildings, temples, mosques, churches, synagogues, served both local populations and traveling merchants of various faiths. Administrative structures housed customs officials, tax collectors, and other authorities regulating commerce. Service economies flourished in these trading centers. Innkeepers, cooks, and bathhouse operators provided for travelers' physical needs. Entertainers, musicians, dancers, storytellers, and prostitutes offered diversions for merchants far from home. Craftspeople repaired damaged goods and equipment, or created new products, incorporating influences from passing trade. Financial specialists facilitated complex transactions across currency zones and provided credit services. Together, these occupations created distinctive urban economies, oriented around the needs of commerce. The cosmopolitan character of major trading cities created unique cultural environments. In places like Chang'an, during the Tang dynasty, or Baghdad, under the Abbasids, residents encountered diversity in everyday life. Different languages in the marketplace, varied styles of dress in the streets, multiple cuisines available for consumption, and diverse religious practices visible in public spaces. This exposure to difference fostered pragmatic tolerance in commercial contexts, even when religious or political authorities promoted exclusivist ideologies. Women played more significant roles in the commercial culture of the ancient network than conventional historical narratives often acknowledge. While long-distance trade expeditions remained predominantly male enterprises, due to physical dangers and cultural restrictions on female mobility, women participated extensively in the commercial life of trading centers. They worked as innkeepers, food vendors, textile producers, and marketplace sellers. Elite women sometimes controlled substantial commercial investments, acting as silent partners who provided capital for trading ventures. The textile industry, particularly crucial to the network given the prominence of silk and other fabric trades, employed predominantly female labor in many regions. From Chinese silk workshops to Persian carpet manufactories, women performed the painstaking work of spinning, weaving, and embroidering textiles that would travel thousands of miles. In some areas, such as Sogdiana, archaeological evidence suggests women managed substantial textile workshops that produced luxury goods for export. Cross-cultural marriages frequently occurred in trading communities, creating families that embodied the network's connective function. Chinese historical records mention Western merchants who married local women in Tang dynasty cities. In Central Asian oasis towns, genetic studies of ancient remains reveal individuals with mixed ancestry from distant regions. These marital alliances often served commercial purposes, creating kinship bonds that facilitated business relationships across cultural boundaries. The children of such unions grew up in multicultural households, often acquiring multiple languages and cultural competencies that proved valuable in commercial contexts. Some historical sources mention individuals with mixed heritage who served as cultural intermediaries, interpreters, guides, or diplomatic envoys who could navigate different social systems. These bicultural individuals embodied the network's integrative effects at the most personal level. Nomadic peoples played distinctive roles in the transcontinental exchange system, sometimes serving as predators on trade through raiding, but more often participating as producers, protectors, and transporters. Steppe nomads supplied horses, wool, leather, and dairy products to settled communities. Their mobility and military prowess made them valuable as caravan guards in dangerous regions. Some nomadic groups specialized in transportation services, renting camels, or serving as guides through territories they controlled. The relationship between nomadic groups and sedentary powers fluctuated between conflict and cooperation. During periods of strong central authority in China, Persia, or Central Asia, imperial governments often negotiated arrangements with nomadic leaders to ensure safe passage for caravans, sometimes paying substantial subsidies. When central authority weakened, nomadic groups might increase tolls, engage in more frequent raiding, or establish their own trading cities to capture commercial profits directly. The movement of people along the network created multicultural frontier zones where diverse populations interacted on a daily basis. In oasis cities like Turfan, Dunhuang, or Samarkand, archaeological and textual evidence reveals communities where multiple languages were spoken, various religious traditions practiced, and different culinary traditions maintained. These frontier societies developed pragmatic approaches to cultural difference, creating shared commercial spaces while maintaining distinct community identities. Environmental challenges shaped daily life along much of the network. Water management remained a constant preoccupation in arid regions, with elaborate systems of underground channels, cisterns, and irrigation networks requiring collective maintenance. Fuel scarcity affected cooking practices and heating options in desert regions. Extreme temperature variations between seasons necessitated adaptable architecture and seasonal adjustments to daily routines. These environmental constraints created distinctive regional adaptations in material culture and social organization. The transmission of disease represented one of the network's most significant but least intentional forms of exchange. Merchants and travelers unknowingly carried pathogens between previously isolated disease environments, occasionally with devastating consequences. The Justinian plague of the 6th century and the Black Death of the 14th likely spread along trade routes, causing demographic catastrophes. On a less apocalyptic scale, everyday travelers experienced illness as they encountered unfamiliar diseases, creating demand for medical practitioners who combined healing traditions from different regions. Medical knowledge itself traveled the network, creating hybrid healing traditions that incorporated elements from multiple systems. Persian physicians adopted techniques from Indian Ayurvedic medicine. Chinese doctors incorporated herbs from Central Asia into their pharmacopoeia. Greek medical theories traveled eastward, while Chinese concepts of pulse diagnosis moved west. Merchants often carried medical texts and substances as valuable trade goods, recognizing the universal demand for effective healing practices. Culinary exchange represented another aspect of daily life transformed by the network's connections. The movement of crops, peaches and apricots from China to the Mediterranean, citrus fruits from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, cotton from India to Central Asia, gradually altered agricultural patterns and diets across Eurasia. Spices from tropical regions became status symbols in distant kitchens. Cooking techniques and food preservation methods spread alongside ingredients, creating fusion cuisines in cosmopolitan trading centers. Entertainment and leisure activities in trading cities reflected cultural blending and commercial connections. Musicians incorporated instruments and melodies from distant regions into their performances. Board games like chess spread across cultural boundaries, evolving different rules and piece designs in various regions while maintaining their basic structure. Storytellers incorporated tales from distant lands into their repertoires, creating narrative traditions that combined elements from multiple cultural sources. Educational practices along the network often reflected commercial priorities. In many trading communities, young boys received practical instruction in arithmetic, weights and measures, geography, and foreign languages alongside religious education. Some merchant families sent sons to study in distant cities to gain language skills and commercial contacts. In cosmopolitan centers like Chang'an or Baghdad, educational institutions attracted students from diverse backgrounds, seeking specialized knowledge in fields ranging from astronomy to medicine to religious studies. For ordinary inhabitants of farming villages and small towns along the routes, the passing caravans brought occasional glimpses of a wider world. The arrival of merchants might offer opportunities to sell agricultural surplus, purchase small luxuries, or hear news from distant places. Local craftspeople might adapt designs from imported goods, gradually incorporating foreign motifs into local aesthetic traditions. Religious ideas and practices sometimes diffused from trading centers into surrounding rural areas through the activities of missionaries or returning local travelers. The archaeological record reveals the material dimensions of daily life along these passages. Excavations at sites like Penjikent in modern Tajikistan have uncovered ordinary houses with storage areas for trade goods, workshops producing export items, and wall paintings depicting merchant caravans and commercial activities. Personal possessions found in tombs and abandoned dwellings. Ceramic vessels combining design elements from different regions. Textiles incorporating diverse motifs. Imported luxury items testify to the network's influence on everyday material culture. Written sources provide glimpses of individual lives entangled with the commercial network. The Sogdian ancient letters, discovered in a watchtower near Dunhuang, include poignant personal correspondence alongside business matters. A merchant woman writes to her mother, complaining of abandonment by her husband, while another letter describes a community of Sogdian merchants forced to flee from unrest in northern China. These rare first-hand accounts humanize the abstract patterns of historical commerce. Religious structures along the routes served both practical and spiritual functions in daily life. Buddhist monasteries offered lodging to travelers, while also serving as banks, storing valuables and facilitating money transfers between distant locations. Christian churches maintained guest quarters for co-religionist merchants. Mosques provided familiar spaces for prayer and ritual cleansing for Muslim traders far from home. These institutions often accumulated wealth through donations from successful merchants seeking spiritual merit or community recognition. The rhythms of commercial life followed seasonal patterns dictated by climate and agricultural cycles. In many regions, winter snows closed mountain passes, creating distinct trading seasons. The annual Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca, Hajj, created predictable trade fairs that attracted merchants from across the Islamic world. Agricultural harvest times determined when certain goods became available for export. These natural and cultural calendars created a temporal framework that organized commercial activities across vast distances. For all its cosmopolitan connections, daily life along the network remained deeply embedded in local realities. Most inhabitants of trading cities primarily engaged with their immediate social worlds: family, neighborhood, religious community, professional guild, while benefiting from the economic opportunities and cultural influences that long-distance connections provided. The transcontinental commercial system represented an additional layer of experience, rather than a replacement for local identities and traditions. The archaeological and textual evidence of daily life along the network reveals neither a utopian multicultural paradise nor a world defined primarily by conflict between civilizations. Instead, it shows pragmatic adaptations to the opportunities and challenges of cross-cultural exchange. Communities developing practical arrangements for commercial cooperation while maintaining distinct identities. individuals navigating multiple cultural systems while remaining grounded in particular traditions, and material cultures incorporating foreign elements while preserving distinctive local characteristics. The human experience of the ancient network reminds us that grand historical processes ultimately unfold through the everyday decisions and actions of ordinary people. Merchants calculating profits and risks, artisans adapting designs to appeal to foreign markets, innkeepers accommodating travelers from distant lands, farmers adjusting cultivation patterns to meet new demands. In their collective activities, these individuals created and sustained one of history's most remarkable achievements in cross-cultural connection, leaving legacies that continue to shape our global civilization. As the ancient pathways that once carried silk and spices across continents gradually faded from active use, they left behind a complex legacy that continues to shape our modern world. The connections forged through centuries of exchange altered human societies in profound and often irreversible ways, transforming cultures, technologies, religions, and even the biological composition of populations across Eurasia. This enduring impact extends far beyond the mere movement of luxury goods, touching virtually every aspect of human civilization. The biological exchanges facilitated by the ancient network permanently transformed ecosystems and human diets across continents. Fruits like peaches and apricots, originally domesticated in China, became staples in Persian and Mediterranean orchards. Citrus fruits traveled westward from Southeast Asia, eventually reaching Europe and later the Americas. Grapes and alfalfa moved eastward from the Mediterranean basin to China. Spices from the tropical regions of South and Southeast Asia became essential components of cuisines thousands of miles from their origins. These botanical transfers revolutionized agriculture across Eurasia, introducing new cultivation techniques alongside new crops. Persian irrigation systems spread eastward into Central Asia and westward across North Africa. Chinese agricultural innovations, like efficient iron plows and advanced rice cultivation methods, diffused to neighboring regions. These exchanges gradually transformed the diets and agricultural practices of entire civilizations, creating new culinary traditions that blended influences from distant regions. Disease organisms traveled alongside crops and commodities, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. The bubonic plague that devastated Eurasian populations in the 6th century, the Justinian plague, and again in the 14th century, the Black Death, spread along commercial pathways, carried by fleas on rats that stowed away in merchant caravans and ships. These pandemic events caused demographic collapses that transformed social structures, labor relations, and religious practices across vast territories. Human populations themselves mixed along these routes, creating genetic legacies that persist in modern populations. Recent genomic studies have revealed the extent of this biological exchange. Analysis of ancient DNA from burial sites along the network shows individuals with ancestry from distant regions. East Asian genetic markers in Central Asian populations, European markers in Chinese frontier communities, and complex patterns of admixture throughout the regions connected by trade. The cultural exchanges facilitated by these commercial networks transformed intellectual traditions across Eurasia. Mathematical concepts flowed in multiple directions. The Indian numerical system, including the crucial concept of zero, traveled westward through the Islamic world to Europe, while Chinese mathematical techniques moved into Central Asia. Astronomical knowledge from Babylonian, Greek, Indian, and Chinese traditions circulated amongst scholarly communities, creating new synthetic understandings of celestial phenomena. The transcontinental movement of religious ideas profoundly reshaped spiritual landscapes across Eurasia. Buddhism traveled from India through Central Asia to become a dominant faith in China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, developing distinctive regional forms as it adapted to different cultural contexts. Christianity spread eastward along trade routes, establishing communities as far as China before later contractions. Islam followed commercial networks across Central Asia and into Western China, as well as along maritime routes to Southeast Asia. These religious transmissions created new cultural syntheses that remain visible in sacred architecture, artistic traditions, and religious practices across Asia. The Buddhist cave complexes at sites like Dunhuang, Bamiyan, and Ajanta display the evolution of religious imagery as it traveled across cultural boundaries. Islamic architectural styles incorporated elements from Byzantine, Persian, Central Asian, and Chinese traditions as the faith expanded along trade networks. Technologies diffused along these same pathways, often transforming societies that adopted them. Paper manufacturing, originally developed in China around the 2nd century AD, spread westward along trade routes, reaching Samarkand by the 8th century and the Islamic world shortly thereafter. This technology revolutionized information storage and transmission, making books more affordable and contributing to increased literacy rates and scholarly activity throughout Eurasia. The transfer of paper-making technology exemplifies how innovations often transformed as they moved between cultures. Persian papermakers modified Chinese techniques, using new raw materials and developing distinctive sizing methods. These adaptations continued as papermaking spread to Europe through Islamic Spain and Sicily, creating regional variations suited to local resources and needs. Similar patterns of adoption and adaptation characterized the spread of textile technologies, metallurgical techniques, and architectural innovations. Artistic traditions flowed along the commercial arteries, creating hybrid aesthetic forms that combined elements from diverse cultural sources. The most famous example may be the Greco-Buddhist art of Gandhara, which merged Hellenistic sculptural techniques with Buddhist iconography, creating a distinctive visual language that influenced religious art across Asia. Similar processes of artistic exchange occurred in textiles, ceramics, metalwork, and other decorative arts, as artisans incorporated foreign motifs and techniques into local traditions. Languages and writing systems spread along with trade, creating new linguistic communities and facilitating cross-cultural communication. Sogdian, an Iranian language, became a lingua franca of the Silk Road during the Middle Period, used in commercial documents from the Mediterranean to China. Later, Persian served similar functions across much of Central and South Asia. The spreads of alphabetic writing systems from the western regions of Eurasia transformed literary cultures across the continent. The legacy of these ancient exchanges extends beyond tangible cultural elements to encompass institutions and practices that structure modern global interactions. Contemporary international commercial law incorporates principles developed to facilitate trade between merchants from different legal traditions. Financial instruments, like letters of credit and commenda partnerships, developed to manage the risks of long-distance trade, evolved into modern banking and investment practices. Even diplomatic protocols bear the imprint of practices developed to facilitate interaction between political entities connected by trade. The exchange of ambassadors, the use of written communications in multiple languages, and ceremonial practices surrounding diplomatic encounters all evolved through centuries of cross-cultural contact along the commercial networks. These institutional legacies structure international relations, in ways that participants rarely recognize as products of historical exchange. The historical memory of these ancient connections has itself become a powerful cultural resource in the modern world. The term Silk Road, coined by German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, has evolved from a scholarly concept into a potent metaphor for cross-cultural exchange and peaceful interaction between civilizations. This romanticized vision of the historical network has been deployed for various cultural, political, and economic purposes in contemporary societies. Tourism along the historic routes has developed into a major economic sector for many countries. Sites like Samarkand, Bukhara, Dunhuang, and Xi'an market their Silk Road heritage to international visitors, often emphasizing romantic visions of camel caravans and exotic bazaars. UNESCO has designated numerous Silk Road sites as World Heritage locations, providing both protection for historical monuments and frameworks for tourism development. Museums across Eurasia and beyond showcase artifacts from these ancient exchanges, constructing narratives about cultural connections that often serve contemporary diplomatic and political purposes. Exhibitions featuring Silk Road treasures become vehicles for cultural diplomacy between modern nations, symbolically reinstating connections that existed in the pre-modern world. These museum presentations typically emphasize peaceful exchange while downplaying historical conflicts and exploitation. Academic interest in the historical network has flourished in recent decades, with archaeological projects, language studies, and historical research illuminating previously obscure aspects of transcontinental exchange. Digital humanities initiatives have created virtual archives combining materials from collections across the world, allowing scholars to reconstruct connections that were severed by modern political boundaries. This academic work often explicitly positions itself as recovering knowledge that challenges nationalist historical narratives. The most ambitious modern invocation of the ancient network is China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Announced in 2013 as a massive infrastructure development program spanning much of Eurasia and extending to Africa. This project explicitly frames itself as a revival of the ancient Silk Road, positioning contemporary Chinese economic expansion as a continuation of historical patterns of mutually beneficial exchange rather than as a novel form of influence. The BRI encompasses both overland transportation corridors through Central Asia and maritime shipping lanes through the Indian Ocean, consciously paralleling both the terrestrial and maritime dimensions of the historical network. This massive investment program includes railways, highways, ports, pipelines, and digital infrastructure, creating new physical connections between China and markets across Eurasia and Africa. The political rhetoric surrounding this initiative deliberately evokes the cultural exchanges and commercial prosperity associated with the historical Silk Road, while minimizing less positive aspects of that history. This selective use of historical analogy illustrates how the legacy of the ancient network has become not merely a subject of scholarly interest, but also a resource for contemporary geopolitical projects seeking historical legitimacy. Beyond specific initiatives like the BRI, the concept of the Silk Road has become a powerful metaphor in international relations discourse. Political leaders invoke the historical network when advocating for open trade policies, cross-cultural dialogue, and peaceful coexistence between civilizations. International organizations sponsor Silk Road, cultural festivals, academic conferences, and economic forums that frame contemporary globalization as a continuation of historical patterns of exchange. The environmental challenges facing many regions along the historic routes connect past and present in more material ways. The same water scarcity issues that ancient oasis settlements struggled with, now confront modern cities in these regions, often exacerbated by climate change and population growth. Archaeological and historical research into traditional water management systems sometimes informs contemporary sustainability efforts in these arid landscapes, as modern societies confront the complexities of globalization, its opportunities and challenges, its inequalities and connections. The history of the ancient network offers valuable perspective. It reminds us that cross-cultural exchange has deep historical roots, that civilizations have always been interconnected rather than isolated, and that the movement of goods has invariably been accompanied by the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The legacy of the ancient commercial passages extends beyond museums and history books into the fabric of our daily lives. The foods we eat, the technologies we use, the religious traditions we practice, the languages we speak, and even the genetic heritage we carry within our bodies. This enduring influence testifies to the profound impact of these trading networks on human civilization, an impact that continues to shape our world in countless visible and invisible ways. Perhaps the most significant legacy of all is the demonstration that diverse civilizations could create systems of peaceful exchange. Despite differences in language, religion, and cultural values. While conflict certainly occurred along these routes, the predominant pattern was one of pragmatic cooperation for mutual benefit. This historical example of sustained cross-cultural interaction offers both inspiration and practical lessons for our increasingly interconnected global society. The story of these ancient pathways connecting distant civilizations thus remains not merely historical curiosity, but living heritage, a testament to human ingenuity, adaptability, and the enduring power of peaceful exchange to transform societies across vast distances and across the centuries.